It's 3 minutes after 10. I think I got my Ronnies the wrong way round last week. I think that it was Ronnie Corbett in the chair and Ronnie Barker asking the questions. But there's that famous Mastermind sketch where somehow you're answering the question that was asked before and the answers render the question that's just been asked doubly hilarious. I've got my own version of that today. The first text to arrive in my inbox this morning, 4 minutes after 10, has got the two Ronnies written all over it. It goes, lols, I'm not going to read the one that came previously. It simply says, lols, sorry, just realised I'm listening to yesterday's show. If you were really in the mood for some mischief, you could send me texts that were responding to yesterday's show but could be construed as responding to today's show in a completely comical or surreal way. But we are not Ronnie Barker, so it's highly unlikely that we would be able to cobble together comedy of that quality. 4 minutes after 10 is the time. I knew this was going to happen. I told you it was going to happen. If there was any doubt in our minds whatsoever that it was going to happen, that doubt disappeared yesterday. But the people for whom we need a slightly better name or nickname now are doing what I suppose their moral and intellectual bankruptcy demanded that they had to do. They are now pretending that the war they wanted and the war they attacked Keir Starmer for not joining and the war that they welcomed gleefully because their hero, Donald Trump, whose racism, misogyny and climate change denial are like intravenous drips to what passes for their brain, it is going disastrously. So they're all pretending that the only thing they want to talk about is the price of petrol in this country and that it is somehow the government's fault that the price of petrol is going up. It's a situation of, absolutely insane proportion. You've got Logan Roy. Did you watch Succession? That superb television drama, one of the finest ever, featuring Brian Cox playing a sort of Rupert Murdoch tribute act. And his own children at one point received, for me, the best line of the entire series. You are not serious people. And I feel like that sometimes about the British media. Not the British people, God forbid. We can only work with what we're given. But the British media, and sadly the right wing now of British politics, that wasn't always the case. But it's as if their brains have been boiled in bile and they've arrived at a place where everything is an opportunity to garner clicks on social media for attacking the currently unfortunate character charged with actually leading the country in a world that actually exists, as opposed to these fantasy worlds that can be conjured up on social media and increasingly elsewhere. What's the most important thing to talk about? Donald Trump's war in Iran. What are you going to talk about? Why Keir Starmer should do more about the price of petrol. Oh, that's odd. What was your attitude to the war when it started? Loved it. And what do you do about it now? Don't mention it at all. I've turned into Basil Fawlty. Don't mention the war unless, like Kemi Badenoch, who manages to go through entire episodes of Prime Minister's Questions without mentioning the war, that is by far the biggest geopolitical event to unfold in the course of her entire leadership of the Conservative Party. Just think about that for a nanosecond. The biggest geopolitical event that she will probably be the leader of the opposition for. And she called it hideously and completely wrong at the outset, and therefore has proved incapable of even mentioning it subsequently, except to pretend that there is some way in which you can lower the price of petrol in this country by drilling for more oil in the North Sea, until she was compelled to concede that that is simply not true, despite what right-wing newspapers and commentators continue to claim. And then secondly, that it is somehow Keir Starmer's fault that the cost of fuel and indeed the cost of living is going up. Why am I talking about this? Well, it's the IMF today, I think, joining the OECD, but certainly all the big international players when it comes to financial forecasting and prediction are warning that we, by which I mean you and me, those of us in the United Kingdom, are especially exposed, we touched on this yesterday, to higher oil and gas prices, and that it is best viewed, according to the International Monetary Fund, as and I'm going to quote this word for word, a large sudden tax on income. The world faces yet another shock, they explained. And at risk of adding to your burdens, it made me reflect upon how little we know about the stuff that really matters, or at least about the stuff that doesn't matter until it really does. One of my all-time favourite subjects on this programme, we stumbled into it about 10 years ago, was, oddly enough, the business of finding a care home for an elderly relative. And it was while we were discussing that I stumbled into a phrase to describe subjects that this sort of media was invented for. The subjects about which you know nothing until you need to know everything. You've got to find a home for your mum. Your dad's got dementia, you've got to get them into a home. You know nothing about this subject. It's not unlike the first time you're in charge of dealing with a death in the family and you find yourself sitting across the desk from an undertaker in a strange sense of surreal and utterly unfamiliar. But this is bigger because it can be a years-long exercise and you know absolutely nothing about it until you suddenly need to know everything. And I look at stories like the one today, and fair play to the Daily Telegraph, which is absolutely bonkers once you get into the opinion sections of the newspaper, but continues to do good reporting in much of the news department, something that no doubt explains why the biggest media company in Germany has just bought it. You read that the International Monetary Fund is warning that we are especially exposed to higher oil and gas. If you weren't listening to yesterday's programme, you won't really know why that is. Or you may not know why that is. And the second question, at risk of sounding like Donald Rumsfeld, is just an illustration of how little we know. And I've got a horrible feeling that because the Daily Mail and the comment section, but not the news section of the Daily Telegraph, and all of the right-wing broadcasters whose names trip off your tongue so winningly, all of these clowns and traitors who lined up to claim that we should be in lockstep with Donald Trump and that Keir Starmer was somehow wrong to resist this hideous, ridiculous and illegal war that is almost certainly going to make the hideous Iranian regime more powerful and more dangerous than it was before, both domestically and internationally. All of these people are now just sort of pretending that it's not really happening or focusing on petrol stations. Where's Farage? When's the last time someone asked Farage about his absolutely full-throated support for this war? No wonder the fella's keeping a relatively low profile at the moment. Well, why is he not being asked to account for his slavish support for this exercise? It's not a rhetorical question. He has to be asked eventually. Badenoch, touring around everywhere at the moment, cosplaying as a firefighter, I think, yesterday. Why is she not being asked to account for her absolute reverse ferret? We are not a serious nation when our media lets us down in this way. Because Keir Starmer, for his myriad faults, and we'll get on to some of them in the second hour, Keir Starmer, for his myriad faults, has called this absolutely correctly, and yet we are still in a very deep hole, and it is getting deeper. Donald Trump is mad. This is not really a subject for debate anymore, although you are absolutely and always welcome to debate it. You are welcome to tell me that he's as sane as the day is long and that everything he's doing is both justified and ancient. 0345 60973 for the KLF fans. I reject that analysis, but I'm always open to persuasion. And because he is mad, apparently mad, you find yourself in this curious position, as we have touched on many, many times together, of not knowing what you're supposed to do. If you can tell the truth, you can talk about it. If you can't tell the truth because you sold your soul to Donald Trump's racism, misogyny and climate change 10 years ago and you still haven't got a receipt for it, then you can't talk about this war. And because we're not talking about this war, we're going to be even more surprised by the impact of it. We're going to be even more surprised when it becomes apparent that we are more exposed to the Middle Eastern energy crisis, because that's what it is, to the Middle Eastern energy crisis, than pretty much any other country. We're not top of the tree, but we are definitely one of the countries that will face the biggest blows. You know, China's already banned all fuel exports. The world is moving and responding to this. And Donald Trump is doing what we said he would always do. He's moving around like a showerhead in the bottom of the bath with the water pressure on full, bouncing here, bouncing there, spraying everywhere, utterly meaningless, contradictory, unhelpful, dangerous, illegal, threats and then not threats, deadlines and then no deadlines, ultimata that are then withdrawn. It's absolutely insane. It's so insane that even those of us who've been correctly calling it since it started sometimes balk at the insanity of it all and think, well, what's the point in even discussing it? Because it's so deranged. But you have to discuss it, not least because we're about to get spanked. We're already getting spanked by geopolitical affairs that have next to nothing to do with the leadership of this country. I hate those kind of conclusions. I don't like the sort of post-Suez comparisons. It's a reminder of just how small we are now on the international stage. Because they seem to me to be a little bit meaningless. It's like the anti-Daily Mail position, as in the polar opposite of the Daily Mail. They're pretending that we're still Rule Britannia, and other people are pretending that we've been absolutely broken by events. The truth lies somewhere between those two positions. But you do realise at moments like this, there's nothing we can do to mitigate the massive majority of the impacts that are heading our way. Oil's up to $116 a barrel, fell back to about 112 yesterday. This after the G7 talked about unjustified export restrictions. And, you know, we are still in the G7. We're not in the EU, whose heft is, of course, magnified by volume at times like this. Public transport. We should all be thinking about getting on public transport. I mean, so many things that we could be doing, but we won't be doing because the people who dominate the discourse in this country have called it so incredibly wrong. It makes their Brexit madness look like genius. That's how badly they've called this. You think about the Daily Mail columnists who were talking about how ashamed they were to be British. I think one of them's got a column today. We must have a look at that before the end of the programme. What do they write about when they can't write about the biggest geopolitical event that they have witnessed in 20 years? What on earth do you write about if you've handcuffed yourself to Donald Trump and then pretended that you haven't? What do you talk about? What do you write about? Petrol prices for the next 10 weeks, 10 months, however long this madness lasts? I do not know. So, genuine question, all answers valid. How does it end? So Trump's doing what we said he would do now. Marco Rubio's made a little list. Oh, bless him. Marco Big Shoes has made a little list. And it's a list of things that are now the objectives. They couldn't tell you what the objectives were at the beginning because they went to a different school. They kind of hinted that regime change was an objective, but of course it's the old fella's son who's currently in the chair. They hinted that a removal of all military capabilities was the objective, but of course they have realised that they can't do that, so now we're looking at the possibility of troops on the ground. Can we make a little promise to each other? Can we try really hard? And this probably involves you policing me a little bit more closely than I police you. Can we try really hard not to say boots on the ground? Because they're human beings in those boots. It's people's partners, people's children, people's parents in those boots that Donald Trump is, shall we just say, somewhat uncaring of. It's not boots on the ground. I understand the phrase, and it'll be a very lonely path that we plough together, but I think it's important. It's troops on the ground. It's people on the ground. It's humans at risk and poised to make the ultimate sacrifice. Previous members of the US military personnel who have made the ultimate sacrifice have, of course, been roundly maligned and insulted by Donald Trump, as have the 457 British members of the service personnel who died in Afghanistan. So this is all why the clowns and traitors who stapled themselves to Donald Trump's racism, misogyny and climate change denial, the Farages, the Little Johns, the Badenochs, the rest of them, this is why they can't really talk about it honestly or openly now. There's the hideousness of it. The hideousness of it. Where was I the other day? And someone was talking to me about the comments that were made. I was in a pub out in Surrey, and a bloke just sort of started talking to me about current affairs. He obviously knew who I was, and he's not ex-military, his dad's ex-military. The level of emotion that was prompted by Trump's comments about our Afghan veterans, utterly ignored by the newspapers and the commentators who paint themselves as patriotic, who claim to sort of speak for the majority. Where was Farage, interestingly enough, when dead British soldiers were being roundly and hideously insulted by his second favourite politician on the planet after Vladimir Putin? It's insane how the discourse in this country is currently unfolding. And a large part of the problem now is the fact that the discourse is dominated by people and institutions, organisations and outlets that were so bent by Brexit and so broken by Donald Trump that they have ended up stapling themselves to a campaign that is objectively, outwardly, and irrefutably ridiculous, dangerous and wrong and illegal. So the only question the rest of us are left with is, how does it end? I just want to know what you think today. Let's do a bit of joint therapy together. I don't see any way in which it can be made to end. They've already ridden roughshod over requirements for congressional approval. He said something the other day that was hideous, but it got overlooked by all the other hideous stuff that goes on. He sort of let slip. Maybe we should find this clip. He sort of let slip why he calls it a military something as opposed to a war, because if I called it a war, I'd have to get congressional approval. He literally says the quiet bits out loud. He's so dumb. And obviously, to anybody watching, it's a war. It's obviously a war. But it's not a war because they haven't got congressional approval for it. So it can't end that way. The only way in which vice presidents generally sign up to the idea of a president not being fit for purpose is if they're going under the knife, if they're having some big operation. I think it happened to George W. Bush. So I can't really see J.D. Vance leading a reversal from within the White House. So I don't think there are, well, of course there are, because you're going to tell me what they are, but how can it be made, how can it end against his will? 0345 60973. And given that so much of what we feared would happen has happened, that the claim that it's a victory because we've achieved the things that we've achieved, but not the things we said we were going to achieve, which we were never hoping to achieve all along. We only ever wanted to achieve the things that we were capable of achieving, even as we didn't understand what we were capable of achieving. How does it end? How does it end? 0345 60973 is the number that you need. How does it end? And how do I phrase this correctly? Do you want to have a crack if you're really plugged in, if you really know your stuff? Do you want to have a crack at what's going to happen here? 0345 60973. How does it end? How can it be made to end? And I've got a horrible feeling that's a rhetorical question. And then as we learn that the IMF and the OECD and all the big players when it comes to international financial forecasts are saying that we are going to be hit harder than almost anywhere else, I want you to tell me what that means. And I don't want you to hold back on the grounds that it's obvious, because so few people are doing what we're going to do this morning that you kind of have a duty to share what you know. We're going to be hit harder. And I know what exposure to oil and gas prices means, but for example, fertilizers. Did you know that that's huge? And if the fertilizers don't get here, then the crops don't grow. And if the crops don't grow, then what food security we have gets even further compromised. What's going to happen? 0345 60973. And how is it going to, or how might it end? And of course, you can answer that with a don't know. But if you've got a don't know, then you need to move into the second question about what that will mean. And we'll save it, shall we, for another day or another year, on what punishments should be visited upon the people who claimed that they were ashamed to be British because Keir Starmer didn't join this madness, or that they wished Donald Trump was leading us instead of Keir Starmer, or that we should offer our full and unstinting support to this absolute madman in the White House, or that we should be in lockstep with our former allies. Ignorance and bigotry on a scale that would have sent British troops to die at the behest of a man who has insulted in the vilest terms the last 457 to die on an exercise undertaken in support of an American president who was not a deranged liar. That's the mad bit about all of this for me when I step back and look at the big picture. You wanted to send more troops to die in an illegal war started by a man who insulted our dead Afghan veterans, their families, their legacy and their memory. And you're still writing columns for the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph. You're still presenting radio shows. Although, to be fair, if you are presenting a radio show, you probably hit the junctions a little bit more on time than I ever managed to.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It sits a bit with yesterday's show, doesn't it, about the madness of using a moment like this to call for more reliance and more dependence on fossil fuels. By all means, maximise whatever reserves we have, but put all of your major energy into making sure that we are no longer reliant on oil and gas. The ways in which that apparently eludes huge swathes of the commentariat are baffling to me, even after covering these lies and these jokers for the last 10 years. How do you look at Ukraine and Iran and think, I'll tell you what we need to be more reliant on fossil fuels, whether you're sucking them out of the North Sea or whether you're shipping them in from the Middle East or from Ukraine. We need to be more reliant on fossil fuels. Madness. But the Tufton Street lobby groups that call themselves think tanks don't tell you who pays their bills, but influence British media in this country on an extraordinary scale. They're ramping it up. Great opportunity. Great business opportunity. Oh, and while I'm on the subject, which British politician do you... Well, I'll save that for a little later in the programme because I should probably get some calls on. Before that... Just so that you know, I am not imagining this stuff. Here is Trump saying the quiet bit out loud.
Democrats are putting our country at great risk during this period of time, a period that they call a war. They call it a war. We call it a military operation.
I think he also, on another occasion, explains why and actually says we have to call it a military operation because if it was a war, you need congressional approval. I'm pretty sure I've heard him say that. Marco Rubio didn't get the memo.
We are dealing with a 47-year-old regime that still has a lot of people involved in it who aren't necessarily big fans of diplomacy or peace.
And if it fails, the war expands?
What's that, I'm sorry?
If it fails, the war expands?
Well, the war is about this operation, okay, and that's what this is. It's about very specific objectives. The president laid them out on the first night of the operation.
He did it. That's just a lie, though. It's absolutely incredible. But here we are. Was it regime change? Is it the obliteration of all their military capabilities that he's referring to? Because neither of them have happened. John's in Pickering. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, John.
Good morning. Military operation. Didn't Putin call it a special military operation as well?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think he did.
Avoiding
Although,
the
to
use
paraphrase the late
war.
Peter Cook, I never had the Russian, John, but I think perhaps he did. Go on.
So where's this going to end? There's a potential for a new world order here, isn't there? If we have the so-called biggest superpower on the globe ignoring international law, all that will do will embolden the likes of China to take Taiwan, India and Pakistan to carry on their little fracas, as it were. And we either sit back in the sort of into our own states, such as Europe, and we just mind our own business and let it happen, because what else can you do?
I mean, that's not going to happen in the next week or two. And, of course,
no.
Donald Trump is not going to be president forever. I mean, even if he were to subvert democratic norms in the United States, normality has to come back at some point, whether he's still on the board or not. But the I mean, you're going a little bit further down the road than I intended. But the recognition of how fragile everything that we thought was solid really is when you have somebody like him in the White House means that we have to recalibrate. I mean, the problem is, if Farage is Prime Minister or Badenoch, there's no earthly way that they're going to recalibrate our country so that it's no longer in hock to a mad tyrant in the White House, because they, for various reasons, seem to love him.
Yeah, but he's got another 2 years, and that's, what has he done in the last 3 weeks? And how much more damage could he do in 2 years?
Well, that's a question, which you're actually, not to be rude, you're supposed to be answering.
Well, lots, then, is the
answer. I mean, in terms of the end of the current campaign, as opposed to what you've loosely opened the batting with the end of civilization as we know it. In terms of the end of the current war, what's that going to look like? That's the question I think I'm most interested in today. I should have made that a bit clearer in my lengthy, interminable introduction. How does this end?
Well, it's a game of brinkmanship at the moment, isn't it? And Iran seemingly hold all of the... Well, I think it's who's going to blink first. Is he going to put troops onto Karg Island, or is he just going to send them down there in the hope that
But even if he does, it doesn't end necessarily, does it? It sort of... I mean, you look at Vietnam or you look at other military disasters that the United States or other countries have been involved in over the years, and you wonder where the point of no return was, and whether it was miscalculation, misinformation, bad luck or vanity? You know, why did they not realise that things were going to unfold like that? This feels different to me. This feels like a scenario where everybody expert, everybody informed, knows what's going on, knows that the Strait of Hormuz was going to be closed the minute that they started trying to attack Iran, knows that they're going to hold the whole world ransom, knows that they're making billions of bucks a month now. If transit is resumed and they're all paying, is it $20 million per ship or $2 million? I can't remember, but they're paying a bunch of money to the Iranian regime. They're enriching the Iranian regime as a consequence of undertaking this war. When you say brinksmanship, I think history. And I think that's a word that applies to unequal and opposite forces. And I don't know that I can't really see that here. It's unequal and opposite forces, but Trump's not waiting for them to blink. Trump's looking for the least humiliating off-ramp, and that could still be escalation.
Mm.
Oh,
there you go.
No, it's there.
You've
isn't
answered
it?
your own question.
Well, I haven't answered my own question because it's only 10:30 and we're here until at least 11. 0345 60973. The current war, which he can't even call a war, how does it end? 0345 60973. Because I'd put money on that if I could. I would put money on the claim that he's just looking for the least humiliating off-ramp. He's looking for the way in which he can claim victory, which won't be true, but will be the least obviously untrue in his own warped mind. And that might mean putting troops on the ground at Karg Island or elsewhere. There are a couple of other contenders for tactically intelligent destinations, but that might, in his own warped mind, make it easier for him to claim or pretend that he's secured some sort of victory, rather than just calling it quits now and going back. Because you know where we are now. We're at the point where he's threatening to obliterate all the things he told us he'd already obliterated. So how does the current war end? And remember, your answer is as good as anybody's, because nobody knows. None of the experts know, because they are not looking at normal, rational, traditional events. They're looking at a madman. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 10:32. Dominic Ellis has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention, inevitably, correctly and dutifully, to the question of how Donald Trump's war in Iran might or will or should end. And the number you need to contribute is 0345 6060 973. And remember that we are living in such a parallel universe now that they can't even call it a war for reasons that they accidentally let slip in the last few days. I'll share that with you shortly. And while we're talking about key members of Donald Trump's regime, which one does the Financial Times report this morning instructed his broker to buy defence funds before the attack on Iran? So which senior member of Donald Trump's regime, according to a Financial Times report this morning, attempted to make or instructed a broker to make a big investment in major defense companies in the weeks leading up to the US-Israeli attack on Iran? The White House has denied it, but the Financial Times has spoken to 3 people familiar with the matter, they report today. And look, here's a terrifying thing. Okay, and this is partly for all the people who are discovering this program in the United States of America as a consequence of us being on YouTube, because it must just feel so much more acute to you than it does to us. I'm British, right? And I'm terrified by a lot of what is going on. Not in a sort of unmanly way or anything like that, in an intelligent way. In a way that if we were characters in the Leonardo DiCaprio film Don't Look Up, in a way that we'd be listening to what the experts were telling us, and we would be looking up, and we would be counting the days, and we would be desperately searching for solutions. And that's why I'm terrified, because I don't think we fully appreciate yet the scale of the disaster that we are already in, but teetering upon the brink of much worse. So for people watching on YouTube, which I encourage you to do, actually, because I'm even better looking in real life than I sound on the radio. I think the most terrifying thing I can say to you today, and it's only 10:37, so don't hold me to it, is that you can't pick one. Which senior member of Donald Trump's regime is most likely to have instructed a broker to make big investments in major defense companies in the weeks leading up to the US-Israeli attack on Iran. And you can't pick one. It's not as if there's one who stands out as being more obviously likely to have engaged in this alleged behaviour than all the others. It could be one of his kids, it could be one of his key appointments, it could be one of his spokespeople, it could be one of his secretaries of state or ministers or whatever they're calling themselves this week. And that's an illustration of what happens when a cancer takes hold of an institution, in that eventually everything is affected. So the Financial Times, probably the most reputable English language newspaper on the planet. And I say probably because, well, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily have been the case before the Donald Trump supporting oligarchy started buying up American media like it was going out of fashion in order to ensure that the American people weren't kept abreast of what was really going on. So for my money, the Financial Times is probably, and I'm talking more than 52% here, it's probably the most august, trustworthy and reliable media outlet, print media outlet in the English-speaking world. Apologies to Australians, because I'm not as familiar with your media as I should be. So the Financial Times reports today that a major member of Donald Trump's inner circle instructed his broker at Morgan Stanley to approach BlackRock about a multi-million-dollar investment for him, for his client. And it was flagged internally at BlackRock, according to the people familiar with the matter, because they will be familiar with and presumably still care about such things like the law. It's a $3.2 billion equity fund which pursues, and I quote, growth opportunities by investing in companies that may benefit from increased government spending on defense and security amid geopolitical fragmentation and economic competition. I look at my inbox now, and it's there's millions. I mean, you know, every suggestion is different. Every couple of messages is coming up with a different suggestion. I'll tell you who it was shortly, but first, have a little listen to this. This is the full version of Donald Trump explaining why he can't call a war.
They're doing it for two reasons. Number one is they want to deflect from all of the tremendous success that we're having in this military operation. I won't use the word war because they say if you use the word war, that's maybe not a good thing to do. They don't like the word war because you're supposed to get approval. So I'll use the word military operation.
I mean, come on. Remember, Dick Littlejohn thinks that we should be ruled by this guy. He thinks that he's never been more ashamed to be British because we're not following this man into a war that he can't even call a war because he's so bent. Listen to that again. Tell me it's not terrifying.
They're doing it for two reasons. Number one is they want to deflect from all of the tremendous success that we're having in this military operation. I won't use the word war because they say if you use the word war, that's maybe not a good thing to do. They don't like the word war because you're supposed to get approval. So I'll use the word military operation.
And remember, troops on the ground, not boots on the ground, people dying, people already dead. And he has to put on a funny voice when he says military operation. Marco Rubio, obviously, briefly forgot about why they can't call it a war.
We are dealing with a 47-year-old regime that still has a lot of people involved in it who aren't necessarily big fans of diplomacy or peace.
And if it fails, the war expands?
What's that, I'm sorry?
If it fails, the war expands?
Well, the war is about this operation, okay, and that's what this is. It's about very specific objectives. The president laid them out on the first night of the operation.
Okay, prediction time. You want to do a prediction? Okay, here's a prediction. Start the clock, please, for somebody in the White House, if not Donald Trump, to describe as fake news the reports in the Financial Times today that a Morgan Stanley wealth manager approached BlackRock about a multi-million-dollar investment for the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. Okay, start a clock. They'll call that fake news. The most reliable and reputable English-language newspaper on the planet versus a man who can't even call a war because he doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that he hasn't got any permission to wage it, democratically endorsed permission to wage it. Start the clock now. They'll call it fake news before close of play today. I'm not exactly Nostradamus, am I, to make that observation. Matt's in Dartford. Matt, what would you like to say?
Good morning. I think the way it ends is that NATO will
breakup from America. So I think European allies are very much on the page of not wanting to get involved, probably can't afford to.
Oh, they would. They would if there was a proper cause or a proper case for it.
Well, no, that's what I mean. Like, it's not legitimate. Sorry, yeah. It's like they want to get involved because they can't afford to, in terms of like they don't want to expend human lives for no reason.
Yeah.
If there's a righteous cause, absolutely. I think actually with that, depending on who the leader is, you've got Keir Starmer, and in that case, we end up, I think, actually becoming more aligned with our European colleagues. Almost like being in the EU again, but not quite. And if he's not in office, it's Farage or Badenoch, then we become an extension of American influence in the region, because that's I think the two ways it's going to go. And I voted Brexit a decade ago, but I would rather, I don't know, the pieces on the board have moved slightly, but I would rather be more aligned to the European countries, both for economic reasons and resources, based on what's happening at the moment, as opposed to being an extension of America, where their self-interest is quite evident, if that makes sense.
Are you suggesting, Matthew, that swashbuckling free trading international Britain is not perfectly equipped to deal with the changing tides of geopolitical events?
Well, yeah, in hindsight, that might be different now, but at the time...
Don't stop it, don't relitigate it. At the time, there was no excuse, and there's even less excuse now, but that ship has sailed.
That's how I see it ending, anyway.
That ship has sailed. Well, you've done what the other fella did, is you've gone further down the road than I want you to, because we're not looking at how the current war ends. How the current war ends. How does this end?
That doesn't end. That'll be another Afghanistan, Iraq. I think it'll be a 15, 20-year thing, with America just pumping money into it for the industrialisation.
And all of the people who voted for him on the promise that would be the very, very last thing he'd ever do, up to and including J.D. Vance's entire political career, built upon a pledge that foreign and Middle Eastern wars would no longer be the business of the United States of America.
If you think Trump's bad, J.D. Vance is 3 times worse. So
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't think he's mad. I think he's cynical. You know, you look at a sort of, to draw British parallels, you look at an honest Bob Jenrick, and you know that he is just calculating what's best for him at every turn. I look at Trump and I see madness. I don't see self-interest. I look at Rubio, I see self-interest, self-advancement. I see them selling their souls in pursuit of advancement. I don't see Trump like that. I see Trump as diabolical.
Yeah, I don't know which one's worse, but yeah, probably Trump.
That's a phone in for next week. Well, I'm away next week. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:48 is the time. Speaking of the people who were desperate for war but now can't bring themselves even to mention it, just a little bit of light relief. I'll read it so that you don't have to. Dick Littlejohn in the Daily Mail today is writing about why he doesn't believe all the young people who claim that they've got ADHD. This is a bloke who 10 minutes ago was insisting that he'd never been more ashamed to be British, that we weren't involved in a war that Donald Trump can't call a war because he's so dishonest, while also opining, Dick Littlejohn now, that he wished that we were led by Donald Trump instead of Keir Starmer. And his comments today on the biggest geopolitical crisis of recent memory, 1 in 8 parents in Britain claims to have a child with disability. That's what he's talking about today. He kind of nods towards what's going on. He tries to make a joke later in the column about about only fools and horses, because you remember all of his points of cultural reference are from television programmes that haven't been made for about 20 years. The other day he was telling us about how terrible it is to live in Britain, and he knows, because although he spent most of his career writing in a gated community in Florida, he watched a 25-year-old episode of The Bill, and things were really different. I think probably not bright enough to realise that the Labour government was in power then, and he was slagging them off as well. But Tricky Dicky Littlejohn in today's Daily Mail tries to make a strange joke about... I can't quite understand it, to be honest. There's a reference to a Carry On film as well, which is, only about 50 years out of date. But then he talks about Lord Haw-Haw. In the Second World War, Britain was subjected to Nazi propaganda from the mouth of Lord Haw-Haw, who we hanged for treason after Germany fell. These days, Lord Haw-Haw would be given his own show on the BBC. Writes a bloke who was recently explaining that he'd much rather have a foreign leader who insults our soldiers after they've died in service in control of this country than the man that we actually elected. I don't know how familiar you are with the work of William Joyce, but he too bigged up a foreign leader who wished our soldiers harm or who insulted our soldiers while claiming to be a genuine patriot. So that's how boiled a brain can become, by bile, Brexit, bigotry, and, of course, a profound and slightly unhealthy love for Donald Trump's racism, misogyny and climate change denial. What are you going to write about today, Dick? Why I don't believe children who've got neurodiversity. And the war? Just going to make a joke about carry on up the Khyber and then describe the BBC as traitors. OK, mate? Well, doubles all round. 10:51 is the time. Matthew is in Chelmsford to take us back to the question of how it's going to end, feasibly, realistically, plausibly. What have you got?
Oh, hi, James. Basically, kind of, whether there's a ground war or not, there's probably going to be a very similar outcome, just a different amount of timing.
Yeah.
I mean, sitting on Carg Island will be like sat in a box of fireworks. And when you go further in, it's going to be even worse. The regime, I don't think the regime will change. Without sort of like going too deep into it, there are so many different layers of the regime. It's almost like being built into it, like a being rolled into the whole society. That the regime isn't just one man at the top; it's layers and layers and layers. So getting a regime change would be absolutely impossible in the short term and even in the long term. So the only way really forward is ground war or not. There will have to be some form of agreement with Iran, and kind of, I think,
an agreement to disagree, not to make light of a very serious situation, but that's probably the best we can hope for. And of course, normally at this point in a conversation like this, I would say, well, the Department of State have let it be known what they think the objectives of the operation currently are, and they've listed them and they've put it on social media: the destruction of Iran's air force, the destruction of their navy. Don't mention the fact that they told us they'd already done this 9 months ago. The severe diminishing of their missile launching capability, ditto, and the destruction of their factories. So already off the table, Iranian nuclear capabilities, keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, regime change, all of the things that they insisted were the reason for the war in the first place, are now off the table. They've put together an entirely new shopping list of things that have either been achieved or they think might plausibly be achieved. But I can't really put that card on the table because they could tear that up tomorrow. It was never about diminishing their missile launching, or it was never about the destruction of their... It was never about... If they destroy the Air Force, the Navy, and the missile launching capability, the Strait of Hormuz is open. But they won't put that on the list because they know that they can't get it open.
Yeah, I mean, all those things. I mean, the agreement would not be done by Donald. He would have some strange, mysterious illness that would mean that he'd have to get someone who could do it in his absence. I'm sure of that one there. He would love to have someone to actually get that one done. But in the long term, I mean, it's because of all the impact globally. I mean, this war is massively impacting people globally.
Yeah, but do we realise that, do you think? I mean, you know why? Well,
it depends what you read and who's looking. I mean, obviously, if you just think about the price of petrol at the pump in kind of, Lowestoft, then you probably don't realise the global impact of people not being able to plant their crops for next year, and they're going to have massive lack of food across Asia and most countries and Africa, and people will be looking towards China. But obviously, I know that you said to a previous caller, don't talk about the long future, the long game, but the short game will be some fake. I wouldn't call it a fake agreement, but some sort of like some really kind of Obama-light agreement, which would be worse than what we had before, and we could even end up where
what we had before was
Israel and Iran.
What we had before was pretty good.
I'm not saying that before was bad, but obviously Trump was saying before was bad, whereas he's going to end up with something.
So I mean, who here would reject the suggestion that he will sign something that is measurably and obviously inferior to what was negotiated by Barack Obama's people and claim that it's much better?
Yes.
And even Dick Littlejohn, even absolute fanboys of Donald Trump are probably not going to argue with the idea that he will sign something, if he did sign something measurably and demonstrably worse than what Barack Obama secured, he will do a lap of honour and claim that maybe I'm giving Dick Littlejohn a bit too much credit there, but anybody honest and decent and true would be able to say that Donald Trump would claim victory even in defeat.
Yes.
And we're not even surprised by that anymore.
No, That's probably the best we can hope for. But long term, it's it is really massive geopolitical kind of rolling of the ball forward.
I've still got normalcy bias there. I know, and I don't even know if we can do a phone-in on it. And you're right, I've been a bit stentorian today in insisting that people confine themselves to the question of how the current war ends, which of course is a question that's impossible to answer. But that's never stopped us in the past, Matthew. What I'm referring to is the normalcy bias that says things will settle down again. Once Trump has gone, the world will settle down again into a semblance of what was there before. And even as I say those words out loud, I'm thinking that's not true, is it? There's 2, 3, 4 callers today all describing major tectonic shifts in the way the world works. Because A, events, dear boy, events. And B, we've seen not only that a lying madman can make his way to the top of the world power pyramid in a democratic country that we consider an ally. We know it can happen in Russia and China, North Korea, but we've seen it happen in the United States of America. So A, events, dear boy, events, and B, the system doesn't work, does not deliver the security and the safety that the founding fathers believed that it would and could and did. Holy moly. Thank you, Matthew. Steve's in Hastings. Steve, what would you like to say?
Just that I take a slightly more pessimistic view.
Yeah, go on then.
The others have been fairly positive up to now.
Okay.
I think that Trump will walk away because of the pressure of his base in relation to no new wars. Yeah. And then I think the Iran campaign with drones and missiles will become more effective, and Israel's defence mechanisms, systems will fail. They will feel threatened, and they will then use nuclear weapons on Iran.
That is pessimistic, and I can't carry on opining that Donald Trump is so mad he would actually do anything. All we then wonder about is whether or not there are any checks and balances left that would prevent him from undertaking such an obviously insane course.
I mean, there is a chance in the sense that the Pakistan representative, I don't know if it's the PM or who it might be, has gone to China to meet with Xi Jinping, and there might be some potential for a grown-up in the form of a Chinese representative in the room to actually get people around the table. Because, as you say, there's been a tectonic plate shift in the world order. And I think a lot of people are sort of trying to get to grips with that. I mean, one of the most significant things is the fact that Japan has bought oil in yuan.
And also that the sanctions on Russian oil have been lifted to allow them to sell oil into Cuba. So, I mean, I love your voice. It's gone like mine does. It's gone up at least 3 octaves. Because
well, I model myself on you, James.
You could do worse, Steve. You could do worse. But the but the evidence of how much madness there is the fact that we miss some of the madness. The Russian sanctions on Russian oil going into Cuba, I read yesterday, have been lifted. So Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, China and Russia, the massive victors from all of this, the stone-cold winners from all of this.
Yeah.
Which, of course, will delight Nigel Farage, but I can't see anybody who is loyal to the interests of the United Kingdom celebrating massive wins for Vladimir Putin. And remember, I've said to you now, for the best part of a decade, that the only thing you can say with confidence about Donald Trump is that he'll never do anything that Vladimir Putin doesn't want him to do. So even as he attacks an ostensible ally of Iran, of Russia, Vladimir Putin's calculation is this is actually quite good for us. Look at the instability. They're going to need our oil, even though it's currently sanctioned somewhat inadequately. Oh, and no one's talking about Ukraine anymore at the moment. And also, how can anybody criticise me for my special military operation in Ukraine when the President of the United States of America is calling his war in Iran, his illegal war in Iran, a special military operation?
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. Just a quick nod back to the conversation we had in the last hour, and it's not really a mystery. You're not going to see a minister doing the rounds at the moment without being asked about petrol prices. It's almost as if the questions for some broadcasters are written by the lobby groups on Tufton Street that call themselves think tanks while refusing to disclose who actually pays their bills. Well, spoiler alert, it's often fossil fuel companies that pay their secret wages. So Kemi Badenoch has been visiting an oil rig in Scotland that turns out to be owned by a bloke who donated more than £250,000 to the Conservatives since she became leader. You couldn't really make it up, could you? So while she's wanging on about the necessity for more drilling while having to concede, when actually finally asked a decent question that it isn't going to affect people's bills directly, she's seen her party take 250 grand from a bloke who still takes oil out of the North Sea. Isn't life grand? Let's get back to Britain now. Well, we've never really left, have we? Because talking about events in the Middle East and the impact that they will have here is probably the next big conversation that we have to have. I don't remember. Do you remember the last time a Prime Minister did this? I mean, it looks like it's quite... what would the word be? I mean, you might say heavy-handed. So the BMA is staging a 6-day strike from April the 7th to April the 13th. So this will kick off just after the Easter bank holiday weekend. There's a little bit of wiggle room with regard to the calculations. But their case is that they want to get... It's another case of Osborne's razor, by the way. It's getting a little bit predictable, isn't it? If you're not familiar with Osborne's razor, it was invented by a texter to the programme called James, and it points out that when you examine the problems that the country currently faces, many of them can be traced back to George Osborne and his decision to punish ordinary working people for the sins of bankers. Or at least the ideology, best described by Alexei Sayle, as a belief that the global financial crisis in 2008 was caused by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton. Osborne probably gets the freest of free passes in British politics. He sort of waltzes around the place with his a shiny face and his strange smile, taking no responsibility whatsoever for the consequences of his policy decisions, of austerity. So Osborne's razor is the increasingly irresistible theory that when you're looking at a problem in this country, you can trace it back to George Osborne. And doctors, their case is, the BMA's case is, that a succession of failures to give them real-term pay rises means that despite getting a big rise when Labour got into power, they still find themselves, they would argue, 26% away from where they would be if their wages had kept track post-2008 with where they should have been. That's the argument, right? So they are asking for more money, but they would say they are not asking for more money than they would be on if it wasn't for George Osborne. A slight oversimplification because they go back to 2008, not 2010, but the point stands. Resident doctors, as they are now known, the artists formerly known as junior doctors, have had, and I think this matters, this is what I struggle with, right? They have had the highest pay rises in the public sector for 2 years in a row. If they were to receive the New Deal, then their pay rise over the past 3 years would amount to 35%. So 35% of well, you know the maths, you don't need me to tell you. I don't mind some of the elements of the coverage today. When you tell me that resident doctors in the final stages of specialty training, speciality training, currently earning £74,000 in basic, would go up to 77,348, plus an average of 20,000 a year for overtime. I don't mind that doctors in their final year of speciality training should be earning more than £100,000 a year. I never quite know how I'm supposed to respond to this when it's framed by right-wing media. You get it a lot with tube drivers. So the kind of politicians who claim that they're speaking up for ordinary working people don't really believe that ordinary working people should earn salaries that are more obviously associated with extraordinary middle-class working people. I always found it weird. I wasn't very, very political when I started in this job. People often think I'm exaggerating, but then they look back at some of the stuff we used to do on the programme and they realise that I'm telling the truth. God, I miss Beat the Sweet. But one of the first things I was shocked by, because I'd listened to some of the older people that were doing the job when I started here, and I'd listened to some of the things they said, and I'd find myself often thinking, well, how does that work? I thought that you were sort of like tabloid journalism is supposed to be about representing the workers against the owners. I was such a sweet summer child. I really was a naive little fool. And then it would often Bob Crow was the leader of the RMT back in the day. He was an absolutely brilliant operator. I think even Mick Lynch would concede that Bob Crow was probably even better at communicating than he was. He tied me in knots on 2 or 3 occasions, Bob Crow, because at the time, and don't laugh, and please don't think less of me, I thought that's what I was supposed to do, because everyone else did on phone-in radio. I thought you were supposed to fight with Bob Crow. So Bob Crow would come on the programme and I'd try and, duff him up a bit. I used to get a bit flustered. On one occasion, I managed to... This is very embarrassing. Thank goodness no clips exist, because the technology back in the day, this must be going back before I had a regular gig, I think, on LBC, when I was just doing holiday cover to pay a tax bill. I'd said, "Why? I can't believe you're going on strike on January the 31st, Mr. Crow. That's New Year's Eve." And he said, "Oh, I think you'll find, James, that is actually December the 31st. Because you should sit in the studio." Oh, dear. Listen, don't get me wrong. I'm very glad we've got a huge audience for this programme now, and I'm extremely proud of how much it's grown by over the course of the last 20 years. But moments like that, you were kind of grateful no one was listening. You'd say, I just managed to get New Year's Eve wrong by a factor of 1 month. And that was because he was such a brilliant operator. But the thing that confused me, and I soon saw the light, was that everybody would be queuing up to claim, well, tube drivers shouldn't be earning £50,000. Tube drivers shouldn't be earning £70,000 a year. Train drivers shouldn't be earning £80,000. And I just remember thinking, why? Because I could see what kind of profits the companies that owned the railways were making. I could see what the post-Thatcherite economic landscape looked like. I wasn't stupid. And I just think, why? Why shouldn't they? And I still don't really know what the answer to that question is, except doff cap, tug forelock, know your place. And then we come to doctors. Why the hell shouldn't doctors in their final year of training be earning that sort of money? Answer, genuinely, is that it's not currently feasible. Not only are we looking at a cost of living crisis right across the board, but we are also looking at a immeasurable impact of events in the Middle East. And, crucially, we're looking at a workplace, we're looking at a market in which resident doctors have already received a much better deal under this Labour government than any other public sector workers. It's Wes Streeting who's trying to use the £100,000 figure as a bit of a mallet with which to hit these people over the heads. First-year doctors, fresh out of medical school, would earn an average £52,000 a year, which is £12,000 more than 3 years ago, which is a telescope, and it depends which way you look through it, doesn't it? It's a very simple question of whether or not you think £72,000, I beg your pardon, £52,000 is a fair scratch for the people that you're entrusting your family's welfare to, your life in some cases and your health, or whether you look at the rise of £12,000 and feel envy. So there are 2 bits to this, because Keir Starmer has done something I can't remember a Prime Minister doing, and he has essentially said, unless you call off this strike, then I will cancel. If you don't call off this strike, I will cancel the deal that we put in place last time. Not for the money, but for the training places. So 4,000 specialty training posts were agreed last time round. Resident doctors can apply for these after their first 2 years of training. What Starmer and Streeting are saying today is that these posts will be withdrawn if the strike goes ahead. And that, I mean, it's my job to explain this to you. That doesn't look very clever to me. Because it's not just the BMA that benefits from training places being made available to 4,000 resident doctors. It's the people that they would treat. It's all of us, no? That's one of the areas in which I'm going to need a little bit of help. So Keir Starmer is saying, call off the strike or lose the 4,000 trading places. If you want to describe it as clever, then you would reach for the fact that a lot of junior doctors, a lot of resident doctors and their representatives argued that the strike wasn't just about money, it was also about training places. So some of the best calls I've taken on this issue since Labour got into power have come from resident doctors explaining to me that it wasn't really about the money, it was about the training places. It was about the fact that you couldn't get a position once you reach this stage of your training. And I believed you, and I still do, but I think he's calling your bluff. I think what Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting are doing is saying to all the resident doctors who insisted that this wasn't really about money, it was much more about training posts in the NHS. I think he's saying, well, if that's true, then you better call off the strike, because I will remove the training posts that you claim to care more about than the money if you go ahead with the strike. I want to get all the moving parts in front of you on this. So on the one side, in one corner, you have the BMA. They've got 48 hours to reconsider their intention to go on strike in the week after Easter. The NHS is turning the corner, by the way. Again, something that may not be widely reported in the kind of media that thinks we should have gone to war in Iran. But you should know that satisfaction rates, which were the highest in history, when George Osborne became Chancellor of the Exchequer, patient satisfaction rates in the NHS was the highest they had ever been, and things are beginning to tick up again. And that is the context in which they're threatening to go on strike. So they've already had a very, very big pay rise. Whether it was enough or not is moot for the moment. You cannot argue with the size of the pay rise they received and that was settled upon them by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Number two, the training places were presented to you and to me as an absolutely crucial constituent of the entire industrial action. We need the training places. And then number three, if you don't call off this strike in pursuit of more money, then we will cancel the training places, which has got a very strong whiff of cutting your nose off to spite your face to me. And all I'm going to do is ask you to pick a side. That's all. In this one, whose side are you on? Because I can't at the moment. I want to live in a country where doctors are among the best rewarded professionals in the country, in our society. And I did for much of my life. I did pretty much until 2008. I want to live in a country where doctors are seen by society as so valuable that they are rewarded accordingly, not seen as something that can be pared to the bone, while George Osborne, who appears only really to respect city professionals and people who work with money rather than human beings, pares their wages back year by year. I want to live in a country where we don't learn that a resident doctor is earning £100,000 a year and feel cross or jealous or angry. I don't live in that country anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. One of the other lessons I learned when I started doing this job was the teachers. The ease with which right-wing media would turn parents of children in schools against school teachers when they took industrial action. It still makes me curdle a bit inside, because it was so extraordinarily effective. I listened to other people presenting phone-in shows when I was in short trousers, professionally speaking, and it would be, let's attack the teachers. 20 years later, of course, they're all pretending to wonder why white working-class boys do worse in school than anybody else. Do you think 20 years of telling their parents that teachers are scumbags might have contributed to it at all, lads? But I don't live in a country where teachers get the respect they deserve, and I don't live in a country where doctors get the rewards they deserve, and I would like to. But it is March 2026, and the world is a complicated and confusing place. But all they're asking for is parity with where they would have been before George Osborne got his hands on the country's purse strings. So I'm not going to apologise to you for not having a clear view on this. I normally side with the doctors. I sided with the government the time before last. I've explained all the moving parts to you. I think the threat to remove the training places is a really interesting part of this. And the question is much, much, much simpler than I normally ask you, which is, Whose side are you on, the doctors or the government? 0345 6060 973. And it's a good question, this, because I think those of us who lived through 14 years of Tory deprivation of the public services kind of expected a Labour government to be on the side of the doctors. You could still argue that they are. The size of that pay rise that was secured within minutes, really, of Keir Starmer getting into Downing Street could be used to argue that they have looked after the doctors. But whose side are you on this one? I've given you the details that you think. I 52-48. I'm not going to tell you which way round I am, but I'm currently 52-48, but my pendulum is ready to swing. So the doctors want, and I'm going to use the word even, which is a provocative word to deploy. The doctors want even more money. The government is threatening to remove training places if they don't call off this strike. And you're sitting between the two like a ball boy at Wimbledon, and you're watching whose side am I on? The government or the doctors? The government or the BMA? And, of course, you can be a doctor and be on the government side. So that's why I make the distinction. The government, the BMA, whose side are you on? And crucially, on this programme, I should make this clear because it's not always the case, but on this programme, you need to know why, all right? You can't just say, well, because I'm always against unions, or I'm always against industrial action, or I'm in favour of all strikes. Because if you're in favour of all of them, you're almost as big a fool as you would be if you were against all of them. So on this one with the specifics I have shared, whose side are you on? It's 11:20.
James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 11 is the time. Sean is currently in the lead for the Text of the Day award, which I never award and rarely remember. But here it would be going, if I did remember. I'm on the side of the people who save our lives and care for our elderly and vulnerable. This isn't brain surgery, unless it is. Brackets, see what I did there, close bracket. Didn't need the brackets, see what... But does that make it funnier or less fun? I don't know. The alchemy of comedy. Keir Starmer's written for the Times today about this, complaining, I think with some reason, that the BMA Resident Doctors Committee has rejected a historic deal. They have 48 hours to reconsider, he writes. For patients, for the NHS and for the doctors they represent, they should. And I 52% agree with him. But I'm open to persuasion. Lee's in Preston. Lee, what have you got?
Hi, James. So I'm a senior nurse in the NHS, and I'm on the side of Keir Starmer with this. I think to your point around what's the motive of junior doctors striking, I do think a large part of it is around the training places, but if they'd have done a mandate just on that, I don't think it would have got through.
No.
So that's why they're using the pay element of it as well, because how can you ask for more money after what you've just been given compared to what nurses, I think we've just been given like 3% or something this year.
I'll play the role of the BMA, and I would point out that you, although you haven't had a great time of it since 2008, you have not suffered in measurable terms the level of disparity between what you're on now and what you would have been on then as badly.
Yeah, but don't forget, James, a lot of these doctors weren't employed in the role when they keep talking about many years ago. Some of them have only been in the job for 3-4 years. And also don't forget...
That's an argument, isn't it? Because what you're saying is, how can they demand parity for a job they didn't have when the wages were higher on average, because they know what they signed up to, as it were. There's some mileage in that, actually. I'm not going to argue with you.
I suppose the other thing, James, as well, is that I don't forget, a lot of people don't realise that the BMA are lining their members' pockets with this. So what happens typically next week is that everyone's planning out about who's going to cover all the rotas, and the consultants will be stepping down. Now, when I was a nurse during the strikes and I was a senior nurse who I worked, I got my normal hourly rate and I was expected to cover the wards. What's happening with the consultants, they get a BMA rate card and it's in the public domain. If they cover during the week, they get £188 an hour. If they do an overnight shift, it's £313 an hour. So it's in the interest of the BMA and their consultant members for these strikes to go ahead, because they are making a fortune covering these strikes. And then what's happening
that's always true. So I need to ask you a question that I try to ask everybody on days like today. Have there been resident doctor strikes in the past that you were supportive of?
I suppose at the beginning when they got the initial pay deal, yes. But I think now...
What about under the last government, when they went on strike under the last government?
And they got a good pay deal. Now they've come up with a different reason about why they want to strike. I also, there's an element of So what the government are doing is they're investing an awful lot in advanced practice roles, or in primary care they're called AAR, so additional roles, so like paramedics and physios, and they're fantastic for supplementing the medical workforce. But I can't help but think part of this strike is because they've had it so good for so long, and it's like, how dare you nurses come and do good jobs like this and do advanced training? You're taking all jobs. It's become quite toxic. Actually, we've lost that ethos of working together, and these strikes are making it quite divisive within the NHS. You only have to look on Twitter at some of the awful comments some doctors are making around advanced practice roles. This is all since the junior doctors' strikes. And it's really, really sad, working in the NHS watching this.
So the sort of divide and rule thing kicking in. I don't really look at Twitter anymore, so I'll take your word for it. There's none of that on Blue Sky. I'm happy to report it's a much friendlier. I'm kind of half joking, but the idea that you no longer move as one, was it ever true that you moved as one? That the healthcare professionals, because you have different unions, did you ever move as one? Really?
I think we worked as a team well, and we did. I think
you still work as a team well. You're not going to be on the ward and giving side eye to the doctor who's next to you.
You'd be surprised, James.
Oh, really? Well, as a consequence of industrial action, like a resentment among nurses of what doctors are doing, resident doctors are doing.
I think not just. To be fair, there are some consultants with a lot of resentment around this as well. It's not. I support the right to strike, and so as nurses, we've done it in the past as well, and I absolutely supported my nurses to strike. But I think, we're all seeing how difficult the NHS is at the moment and the pressures that we're under, and then to put this industrial action on, people having appointments cancelled, people waiting longer in A&E departments, it is making it unsafe, regardless of what the BMA rec Jack keeps coming out saying. It doesn't make it unsafe. It is making it unsafe, and it's on their hands that it is becoming unsafe.
Okay. I mean, again, as with everybody else, even if you are a healthcare professional like Lee is, I am interested in entrenchment. That's why I always ask the question about whether or not you would have been in favour of any round of industrial action. I think Lee sounds like someone who can go either way. And there'll be dispute over some of the detail that he shared. I've already got a consultant telling me they don't get anything like that kind of deal when they fill holes. But we've also got reports that the BMA says that consultants should receive a minimum of £313 an hour for an overnight, 8-hour overnight shift. So these are the BMA's own numbers, £188 an hour for a daytime weekday shift, which tots up, according to Keir Starmer, to £250 million for each strike, because of what the NHS has to pay for in cover. But I'm afraid the cost of something doesn't make it wrong, per se, in and of itself. Just because something is expensive doesn't make it wrong. What makes this wrong for people like Lee, and possibly for you as well, is a combination of factors, including, I think most obviously, the size of the pay rise that has already been secured. I think it came with a little bit of goodwill. I think it came with a presumption, perhaps naively, from Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer, that if we give them a massive one straight out of the blocks, then we'll kind of have some wiggle room. We'll kind of have some space moving forward. And there was a report, wasn't there, about the BMA Resident Doctors Committee swapping messages after it had been secured and saying, right, we'll take this now, and then when they're a year into government, they'll be much more vulnerable, and then we'll hit them again and come back for more. And I read those messages as someone who considers the trade unions to be one of the finest things ever invented on these islands. But I read that and I think, where do you get your line from? I'm not going to get it out of a Murdoch newspaper, which is where Keir Starmer has chosen to write his piece, because Murdoch's attitudes to unions is contemptuous. I'm not going to get it from the BMA Residents Committee, because we've seen that their tactics include trying to undermine governments. I'm going to get it from a resident doctor, but they haven't been balloted on this, so I can't even look at the democratic process that you'd normally be able to look at and say, well, if they're in favour of it, I, as a patient and a parent of patients and a husband of patients and a son of patients in the NHS, I don't really think I can entrust myself and my loved ones to you and not trust you on this. That's what I like about ballots. That's what I liked about the teachers' strike. I'll drop my children off at school and trust you with their lives, but not trust you when you tell me. And this is a bit naive. I'm not claiming everyone should be like me. God, perish the thought. But I can't even reach for that today and say that I'll trust you on this, because you haven't been asked. There hasn't been a ballot. And the deal that has been rejected by the Residents' Committee has been rejected only by the Residents' Committee. So I can't get a number on how many resident doctors don't want to go on strike next week or in a week and a half. Perhaps you're one of them. 0345 60 is the number you need. It's 11:30. Dominic Ellis has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 26 minutes to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Junior doctors, resident doctors going on strike again. Government unhappy about it. So far, so normal. Threat from the government. I wanted to introduce this to the conversation. This doesn't look like very good politics to me. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. Every time he does something brilliant internationally, Keir Starmer seems to do something a bit daft domestically. Doesn't mean that that's the case here. It's just how it looks to me. As ever, you can tell me why I am wrong. But threatening to remove training places surely hurts all of us. You've got 4,000 new training places as part of the last settlement. And how does that help me as a user of the NHS? Why should I be on? I don't know. Maybe you can explain that to me a little bit better than I've managed to explain it to you. The phone lines are open. Zach is in Tottenham. Zach, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
This is a really difficult one for me because I'm a Labour supporter. I'm a big supporter of this government, and I'm also a BMA member. And I really want to see both sides coming together to try to sort out the many problems which are making the NHS unsustainable. Pay is one of those issues, but it is not the only one.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing what's happening, with the strikes and the government's response to it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is the worst of all worlds. I want to see both parties working together, not fighting each other.
Well, would they probably both claim that they've tried and that it's all the other fella's fault that they haven't managed, or the other lady's fault that they haven't managed to reach a resolution?
Yeah, I think the truth is that both sides are probably a bit trapped in this conflict with each other. I mean, Jack Fletcher is not really like the most militant union member.
No, he's not.
I mean, he's not part of the more militant faction that was really driving the pay restoration narrative. And I really want to see the BMA talking more about the other things that are making morale low in the NHS.
Yes.
So, for example, I didn't get into the specialty that I wanted to this year, and that means that I'm essentially locuming. I'm being incentivized massively financially to be like an insecure worker going from hospital to hospital.
And you would rather not be?
Of course not. I want to work for the NHS. I want to be encouraged to develop and become more senior, and that's what I should be incentivized to do. But instead, I'm getting paid way over 100 grand, way more than what the doctors are actually asking for, basically to be a temporary worker from time to time. It's absolutely ludicrous.
I just need a bit of clarification on this. So you're not a resident doctor anymore? You qualify?
No. So I am a resident doctor. So I work as a medical registrar in the NHS.
So by signing up by going where you're needed, you get a premium on your. It's a bit like being an agency worker, but within the NHS.
Yeah, exactly. So so I would only work for the but this is the work that I've been forced into. This is not my choice.
And it would be better paid than if you'd got signed up for your speciality.
Yeah, and actually, what's happening
you're the
is
perfect
many
caller,
of the,
aren't you, man?
Yeah, many of the hospitals that I'm working in, they are dependent on agency workers because there is a planned economy in these training places. There's demand in the hospitals to have more trainees who are specialists. People want to work in those jobs, but the problem now is that the government really isn't incentivized to provide those jobs, and so they're having to pay more in terms of the agency fees. It's absolutely ludicrous.
So, 51.49. I should keep a little ticker going across the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, I'm on the radio, not the telly, so that would be a complete waste of time. But you're pushing me back the other way, because that makes the politics of threatening to remove the specialty training places look really crass.
It's not. It's going to worsen the long-term issues.
Yes,
and I think that.
But if it works, it looks like if it works, it looks brilliant. If you call the strike off, it's a brilliant tactic. If you don't call the strike off and they do it, they follow through on their threat. It's all gone a tiny bit Donald Trump, but they actually follow through on their threat. Then it makes everything worse for everybody forever, or at least for the foreseeable.
But it's the wrong question. Do you support this side or do you support that side? A better question is how do we get both sides to actually
I wouldn't tell you how to treat patients. Don't you come on here and tell me how to run a radio phone-in. No, come on, tell me quickly how to run a radio phone-in. Why is it the wrong question to ask which side you're on for this dispute?
Because it trivialises some of the longer-term complex issues to do with the NHS. Wes Streeting is actually saying a lot of the right kinds of things about what needs to happen to make the service more sustainable. And they're going to need to work with the BMA to make that happen. There's a massive opportunity here in talking about those long-term structural incentives. Why not get more trainee places funded so that more, instead of people being forced into trust-grade jobs or agency jobs, they're actually supporting the NHS in a long-term way to get the waiting lists down and becoming more senior as they're doing that. That would make people feel supported, part of the ward. The system would make sense again. The doctors are not going to vote to go on strike if they are happy in their jobs. The pay issue is a proxy for all of those other things that
and as you say, the direction of traffic is largely positive on a lot of that stuff, as I understand it, and as you just attested. And I fully appreciate the dangers of oversimplifying things. But this is what the Prime Minister says today. I say this to the BMA's, Resident Doctors Committee, reconsider. Give members a say and put this deal to a vote. Failing to do so will mean resident doctors are left with less. The NHS is weakened and patients pay the price. To resident doctors, I say this: make your voice heard. This deal improves your pay, your progression and your future. Do not let others decide for you. Our door remains open. Our shared objectives are unchanged. I apologise for oversimplifying things, but if they put it to a ballot, how would you vote?
Oh, it's a difficult question. I would have to look at the detail. I know it is, but it
is the question, isn't it? That's why I slightly reject the premise, at risk of sounding like Cammy Badenoch. I slightly reject the premise of your point, because a ballot is a binary choice. So you can, we can both examine the detail of it and reject the trivialisation. But when you walk into that ballot, it's yay or nay, Zach. So is it yay or nay?
So, this is, again, I'm going to sort of fall back on the Scottish example, where the BMA there managed to negotiate a multi-year sort of pay increase deal and also open contract negotiations, which would be where a lot of this other stuff could be sorted out. And they actually avoided strike action. I don't think anybody wants to go out on strike. So I'm really depending on the government to put a credible offer, and I'm relying on the residents' committee to look at that offer and then put it to the membership when they think it's credible. I'm trusting in the system there.
Yeah, I hear you.
I want to see people coming together.
You sound a bit like a politician, and I take your central point. So you're looking at an above-inflation pay rise this year, which would bring the overall total over 3 years to 35%. They're pledging reforms to pay progression, as you know, to ensure that doctors are rewarded more fairly. And then you've got your Royal College exams, the cost of which you'll be reimbursed for, and 4,500 additional training places, of which 1,000 would be coming online this month. They would be opening up this month, and then another 3,500 over the course of the next 3 years. They're going to pass a law to prioritise UK medical graduates for specialty training so that other people in the future might avoid where you find yourself this year, and they'll therefore close down the bottlenecks that delay progression and make the UK a less attractive place to be a doctor, says Keir Starmer. So, I think
everything that you've said,
and all that's off the table. All that's off the table if you go ahead, if you and your colleagues go ahead with the latest strike.
Yeah, all of that sounds pretty good to me. So, but like I say, I haven't been balloted on this, so I haven't had.
And you're not going to let me ballot you either, are you?
I don't want to make an impulse decision. I think these things are really
take
important.
Your time. I'll wait.
What you said sounds pretty good.
Well, that's I'm reading what the Prime Minister has said in the Times. So, I don't think Starmer is a sort of Boris Johnson character who will tell you that the moon is made of cheese if he thinks it'll get him out of a little bit of short-term trouble. But it may be that the BMA would challenge some of the claims that he makes. I don't see how, because they seem to be fairly substantive and easily checked. But I respect your caution. There you go. That's the right word to use. I respect your caution. And of course, what Zach reminds us of, I'm not doing this as a mea culpa, but what Zach reminds us of is the size of the stakes here. It's the same with teachers. It's why what I call footballification is so unhealthy for a population, when you just pick a side according to entrenched loyalties. And often, as we discussed yesterday, the big trick of politics in modern democracies is to persuade people to side with the inequality that they are victims of. So, doctors would be paid more. That's got to be better for everybody, right? And there's a limit on it. You wouldn't give doctors £1 billion a year. But having a well-funded, a well-rewarded, happy, high morale health service or education system is to everybody's benefit. But if you are interested chiefly in minimising the amount of money that the wealthiest people in society have to pay into the pot, out of which we all take, then you're going to hate the idea of well-paid doctors or well-paid teachers. The big trick of politics, and Anira Bevan put this a lot better than I ever would, is to persuade people who haven't got any wealth to use their political power to help wealth. Which brings us back to the Tory attempts at the moment to use a crisis caused by dependence on fossil fuel to call for more dependence on fossil fuel. Sometimes the dots really join themselves together. But I don't know that this particular case fits that analysis so completely, because I mean, Zach wouldn't pick. I've gone down from 52 to 51, and then I went back up to 52% when I read out what Keir Starmer claims is going to be taken off the table if they don't call the strike off. Here's the thing. We are in the period of preparation for council elections, so some of the fun that we've been having on the programme by attempting to scrutinise Reform UK as closely as the rest of the media scrutinises all the other political parties has to be put on pause. But I did find until the council elections are over, in case you were wondering what had happened to Henry Riley. He's also going away for 3 weeks, so, the planets have aligned. But I did find myself at the weekend wondering what happened to Farage's whining about, do you remember family voting? The reason why they lost in Gorton and Denton had nothing to do with democracy or people rejecting reforms. Politics of division and bigotry, and of course the absolute clown show of a candidate that they put up in the guise of that Goodwin fellow, who, to be fair to the lad, he's providing an awful lot of comedy to an awful lot of people at the moment, albeit entirely unintentionally. I did find myself wondering what happened to the claims that the police were going to have to get, because it looked to me like a massive bad loser, a massive case of just whinging. You got spanked in a by-election. And you claimed, like Donald Trump did, that you had been cheated somehow, to the point where the police actually looked into it and reached some conclusions that I'll share with you after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 12. As one door closes, another door opens, although actually we're leaving the Henry Riley door slightly ajar, as I'll explain in a moment. But we haven't heard from Noga Tarnopolsky for quite a while, the Jerusalem-based journalist who has steered us through some incredibly choppy waters in recent years. I saw some footage last night that I thought might have been faked, and it involved a extremely right-wing member of the Israeli parliament celebrating the passing of a bill to bring back a death penalty that experts say will only really apply to Palestinian people. But it wasn't the fact that they wanted it that I found shocking, because there are always people who want death penalties to be reintroduced to societies that have managed to abandon such barbarism. Iran, for example, I presume definitely has a death penalty. But they're our enemy at the moment, remember, and Israel is our ally. So they've brought back, or they're seeking to bring back the death penalty. But I was watching some footage unfold, and I saw the lapel of Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's the politician, and I thought, is he wearing a noose as a badge, an actual noose, a golden noose on his lapel, while celebrating the return of death penalty legislation that will almost certainly apply exclusively to people of Palestinian heritage? And I'm afraid the answer to all of those questions is yes. So it struck me as an opportunity to get a long overdue catch-up with Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem, who can also talk to us, of course, about the sort of broader picture of Benjamin Netanyahu's war, which I think I can say with some confidence is increasingly different from Donald Trump's war. Because one of the things I forgot to mention to you earlier was that the Washington Post is reporting that Donald Trump has told aides he's willing to end the campaign in Iran, regardless of what happens to the Strait of Hormuz. And just sort of, presumably, I didn't tell his aides this, but to claim a victory anyway and just hobble home. 11:52 is the time. Henry Riley is here because it struck me at the weekend, Henry, that we were waiting to find out what the police had discovered about Nigel Farage and Matthew Goodwin's whining about why they lost that by-election in Gorton and Denton up in Manchester that they'd expected to win, why they lost it so spectacularly. And they started sort of whining about something called family voting. I believe the police have conducted an investigation.
They have, and they've concluded an investigation, James. So I was there on the night for context, because we spoke the morning after, and this was this news broke just after the polls slam shut at 10 p.m, and so there was all of these allegations flying around that the reason why the Greens, who did look on course to win, but we didn't really realise by how many, they ended up winning comfortably by nearly 4,500, but that we didn't know how they'd done this. And you're right to say senior figures in Reform were pointing to this sort of idea of family voting, basically, which does exist. And the group that alleged it, Democracy Volunteers, is an independent organisation. But on the night, Nigel Farage was calling for a police investigation from Greater Manchester Police. That is what has happened. Just listen, this was Matthew Goodwin, James, the Reform candidate, speaking with LBC's Nick Ferrari a few days after he lost.
Well, the report that you're referring to came out on the evening of the day of voting, just after 10 p.m. And what they found is that usually family voting, the rate of family voting at local elections and so on, is about 4%. At the Gorton and Denton by-election, they found it was over 12%. Now, they released that report on the night of the election because they were, in their words, so concerned about what they were witnessing at this by-election. And Nick, what Nigel Farage has rightly called for is a full investigation into what happened, both by the council and Greater Manchester Police.
And that... Go on, James.
And that is what's happened.
That's what's happened. That police investigation has found there's no evidence, their words, of family voting. Greater Manchester Police had no evidence to suggest any intent to influence or refrain a person from voting, as stated in the Ballot Secrecy Act of 2023. Just to dig into the details, of the 45 polling stations that were there for the by-election, 41 didn't have CCTV activated, which is in line with official advice. Of the 4 that did, 3 polling stations of the 4 found no evidence of family voting. However, when Nigel Farage spoke with our colleague Alex Taylor-Brown, LBC's reporter, he hit out a Greater Manchester
Let
Police.
me guess, hang on, before we play this clip, he's going to do a Donald Trump and ignore the police, ignore the electoral traditions and claim somehow conspiracy and victimhood.
Well, I think it's fair to say he didn't seem to agree with the findings of the police.
Oh, funny that.
True to form. True to form, a Northern Police Force says, nothing to see here, let's move on. And I'd remind people that it was Northern Police Forces who for years and years were told about the rape gangs, the grooming gangs, who said nothing to see here. This is the same phenomenon, it's different, but it's the same thing. It's fear of doing anything because they might offend a certain community. It's a blooming disgrace, and I promise you that our democracy is not in a healthy state.
So are Greater Manchester Police lying when they say that then?
They're turning a blind eye. Very different. Turning a blind eye. Nothing to see here. Everyone move on. They're wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. They're not doing their job. And, you know, we've actually had the secrecy of the Ballot Act going back 150 years, and it's not being enforced. It's wrong.
Is this not just smacking of sour grapes because you lost that?
I've heard this since 2015.
So it's the same, but it's different. But it's the same, but it's different. But it's the same. Whatever. I mean, Alex didn't have a long time with him. What evidence did he provide to back up his claims?
Well, he was on the Greater Manchester Police. The claims about Greater Manchester Police.
Yeah, or the claims about family voting. What evidence did he provide?
Well, he was referring to the report from Democracy Volunteers.
Which the police have considered. So his grounds for calling Manchester police liars or turning a blind eye, what evidence did he provide?
Well, he was, of course, citing the historic failures with grooming gangs.
This is the closest I ever get to him. Henry.
What, me?
So yes, this is it, because you're now in the job of telling me what he's actually said. Also, the Mail on Sunday reported that he claimed foreign-born voters stole the by-election, which means he must have access to very, very secret documents displaying the origins of birth and how people voted. So, I mean, that's extraordinary for Nigel Farage to claim that he knows where people were born and how they voted.
Well, on that vein, James, Alex Taylor-Brown, our colleague who you heard then, did ask Mr Farage a further question about whether this would happen, he suspected, at the upcoming local elections.
Oh, there'll be parts, there'll be areas where this undoubtedly goes on. Areas undoubtedly in which people who've been signed up for postal votes will never even see the ballot paper. It'll all go somewhere else. And this is a particular problem with elements in this country from the subcontinent who are not integrated into our culture and our way of life and who carry on practices that are considered acceptable in Pakistan. Well, I tell you what, they're not here.
And any evidence for that at all? Did he provide?
With what, sorry, Pakistan?
Proof that this is happening in this country, or somehow the crystal ball that he's looked in to tell us that it is going to happen in this country. And do we know how victims of rape feel about being dragged into his whining about losing an election?
Yeah, I haven't heard from that. All I would say, James, is he Democracy Volunteers, this group, not to malign them at all, because they are independent, they're supported by the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, they are doing their job effectively, right, reporting instances when they see this. But what is interesting is, on the night, James, I spoke with someone associated with Democracy Volunteers who said right at the start, we do not attribute this to one specific community. It happens across the board. It happens, And
to be clear, this is things like two people going into the booth together or looking over people's shoulders or talking a bit too much, which I'm afraid Mrs O'Brien and I may have been guilty of in the past when we're particularly if someone comes over to say hello, when we're in the queue for the ballot. There's absolutely nothing in what Democracy Report contended that speaks to a certain ethnicity, a certain group, or indeed a certain background, let alone Nigel Farage's contention that he knows what country these people were born in and how they voted, which is an extraordinary admission. Pretty close to electoral fraud, I'd have thought.
Well, you're right to say there is no breakdown of the nationalities or the places of birth. This often is when people are discussing, they're talking in the polling station, which is not allowed, and the Ballot Secrecy Act is now punishable.
So, absolutely no evidence whatsoever to back up any of his largely racist claims, so he is claiming conspiracy and lies.
That is, the police say that there is no evidence at all. The returning officer has welcomed the investigation, saying that the integrity of the by-election that Hannah Spencer won has not been affected.
And while you're here, because I think you're about to go away for about 7 months.
It's a couple of weeks.
It's only a couple of weeks.
2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks.
Not that I'm counting.
We'll miss you, obviously. Do we know if anyone's ever asked Nigel Farage who won the US presidential election in 2020?
I don't know, actually.
There's one for you when you get back from your holidays.
So you've given it away to everyone now, though.
Yeah, but that means they'll just be even keener to hear the answer.
Yeah, OK.
Am I right or am I right?
I will ask him.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have cleared up that little mystery. Up next, one of the subjects that I've been talking about for all the years in which I've been doing this job, but I wasn't very interested in it when I started, and I'm very interested in it now. I wonder if you can work out what it is. It speaks directly to an awful lot of the problems that we find ourselves contemplating every single day, but it also contains perhaps the kernel of solutions and or improvements, and it's something about which you are almost certainly more qualified to talk than I am.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 12 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Noga Tarnopolsky joining us at about 12:30 from Jerusalem for a bit of a catch-up with, well, all sorts of stories, some perhaps a little bit more obvious than others. But when I started doing this job, I don't know why I've started reflecting on that a lot lately. I hope I'm not planning to retire. I don't know how you'd cope. But when I first started doing this job, I very quickly developed a degree of impatience with repetition. And in retrospect, this was a very big mistake on my part, because if I ask a question and 98 of the 100 people answering it are answering it with the same answer, that's really important and interesting, right? But when I started doing this job, I asked a question and I got lots of answers that were the same, and I became a little bit impatient with the answers. You can tell I've changed because the first week of the war in Iran, we asked the same question every day for a week, 3 times a day, actually. It was all three. I mean, it was extraordinary. Well, apart from Mystery Hour, don't miss Mystery Hour. So I have completely checked, even if some of the answers are the same. Sometimes it's really illustrative and important. In fact, speaking of Iran, that was Farage's voice in the news there, claiming that Keir Starmer is never strong. Despite the fact that Keir Starmer has stood up to the deranged liar in the White House and endured all manner of abuse from him. So the correct action of any patriot, any supporter of this country, would be to back our leader against attacks from a deranged foreign despot. But not if you're Nigel Farage. If you're Nigel Farage, you move on from lying about the by-election that you lost in Gorton and Denton to lying about the Prime Minister of your own country and lying about the fact that the man you admire in the White House is not a liar. That's a hell of a lot of lying for one man, but he's had an awful lot of practice, Nigel Farage. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. And one of the areas in which I think I was at my most impatient, and I hope you weren't listening at the time, I really do, and if you were listening, then I certainly hope that I wasn't actually rude to you, is about youth work. I bet you weren't expecting that one to come out of the left field then, were you? Genuinely, it's about youth work. So we talked about knife crime all the time on LBC. In fact, the first 10 years I was in the job, between, going back about 20 years, so that would be 2006. So the second decade, so between 2010 and probably Brexit, we'd probably talked more about knife crime and grooming gangs than almost anything else that we talked about on the radio. This is, of course, during a period that people now claim nobody was ever talking about grooming gangs back then. We started in 2011 talking about grooming gangs and talking about the ethnicity of perpetrators in a very particular type of crime. So while I hope that the inquiry that is setting out its terms and conditions today can find justice for some victims who haven't found it yet, I'm not massively optimistic that it is going to be able to reach parts that all the previous inquiries haven't reached, because an awful lot of the rhetoric surrounding this scandal and these crimes is contingent upon a determination to believe that only men of a certain background and ethnicity can commit heinous crimes against women and children. And unfortunately, that's not true. I mean, in many ways, it would be good if it was, because it would limit the amount of abuse that is visited upon young women and girls. But it's not true. It's a desperation among certain sections of our society to pretend that it is true that seems to drive a lot of the conversation. As I say, a conversation we've been having in absolutely explicit terms on this programme since 2011, when Andrew Norfolk on The Times first started reporting on it, but not for the first time. You find yourself wondering whether everybody else has forgotten or is just conveniently ignoring the facts and evidence that are easily available in order to pursue their own agendas. So, we used to talk about knife crime all the time, and we used to ask in good faith how it could be reduced. We used to talk about it, I'm afraid, looking back, even on this programme, probably in slightly apocalyptic terms. There were 2 calls I didn't like. I quickly developed an impatience with 2 specific calls that would be repetitious and, to my unformed radio presenters' sensibilities, irritating. One of them I still think is boring, all right? And I'll tell you what that is in a moment. Stephen in Milton Keynes points out, I was also very impatient with people who pronounced HS2 as HS2. But I have to get over things like that. I'm a great believer as I get older in the fact that if I know what you're talking about, then I shouldn't be unduly concerned with how you say things, unless you say schedule, in which case I think you should be sent to prison. So I had a great impatience with people when we were talking about knife crime, who would get on air. This is when I first started developing the bane of Eleanor's life, this is now. And it's been 20 years in gestation, because you're not supposed to do this when you present a radio phone-in show. You're not supposed to say to the producers and the assistant producers that don't put that on. That's just boring. Now, I'd rather sit here and talk uninterrupted for 3 hours than listen to another old man tell me that he used to carry a knife when he was a teddy boy. That's the call I still think is boring, all right? You're talking about knife crime, you're talking about modernity, you're talking about problems that feel very current. and some old geezer rings in to tell you that he used to carry a knife when he was a teddy boy, so he doesn't know what all the fuss is about. Now, I could be wrong, because I'm wrong about the other call I used to reject when we were having this conversation. I realise in retrospect that I should have paid more attention to those people. I should have been listening more closely to what they were telling me and asking more questions to fill in the gaps in my own ignorance. But I still refuse to accept that when you're having a conversation about poverty and violence among young people, being told about the knife that some ex-teddy boy used to carry in Brighton in 1954 is of relevance or interest to anybody. So this is when I started saying, don't put through any... And then I moved into stop and search, which is also, of course, relevant to knife crime. And I said, don't put through any old white geezers who've never been stopped and searched in their lives, but are passionately in favour of young black men who've committed no crime whatsoever, being treated like criminals until they can prove themselves innocent. Because they're not relevant to this conversation either. Unfortunately, I was a bit ahead of the game there, because politics subsequently became dominated by old white men and women who had never been stopped and searched in their lives, but who were absolutely adamant that young black men should be, dangled by their ankles over London Bridge to see if anything fell out of their pockets. If you started treating young rich kids on the King's Road in the same way, if you started just pulling over every young rich kid on the King's Road in Chelsea and dangling them over Albert Bridge to see if any cocaine fell out of their pockets, you would soon hear about it from their parents and their parents' lawyers and their parents' MPs and their parents' employers. But as long as it's young black kids in poor parts of town, treat them all like criminals until they can prove that they're not. Please don't put through any calls like that, I used to say. When I'm talking about stop and search, I only want to talk to people who are regularly stopped and searched. I was weird like that. When I'm talking about knife crime, I don't really want to talk to people who carried knives 127 years ago, like the Peaky Blinders, who didn't actually have a place in our collective consciousness when we were having these conversations. So what was I wrong about? What was the wrong? What did I get wrong? Youth clubs. Youth clubs and youth workers. And I'm afraid that the reason I got this wrong was privilege. Public school privilege. Don't hear enough about that in this country, which is a crying shame because it's responsible for a huge amount of our problems. Not just private school privilege, that's like a watered-down version of public school privilege. Because people who go to public school look down on people who go to mere private schools. Public school privilege meant that I had never contemplated youth clubs as a thing. So I'm doing a really grown-up, important phone-in about knife crime, violence and poverty, and someone rings in and says, I tell you what, James, it's all got worse since we closed the youth clubs. And I go, oh, that's very interesting. And then I take another call and they say, I tell you what, James, it's all got worse since they closed the youth clubs. And by the time I've taken that call 4 times, I'm gesticulating to the producer that I want to hear something else on the pro. Can you get me someone who's not talking about bloody youth clubs? But what if they were all right? What if they were all right? They were definitely all right. It was me that was all wrong. But what if they were all right? What if that was and will be the single most important element of this conversation? And I spent the best part of half a decade dismissing it out of hand because I was ignorant and impatient. Can you think of another word that begins with I that describes me fairly and accurately? Ignorant, impatient and irascible. I was ignorant, impatient and irascible. That's your word for the day. But what if I was... Well, I was wrong. I was wrong. The best way to stop people becoming criminals is to reduce poverty, target prevention strategies at young people, and increase opportunity. This is the parting message of the Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Sir Andy Cook, who is preparing to leave his post after 40 years in policing. He's given an interview to The Guardian, and in it, he reveals that youth work in particular, that's not just youth clubs, but that's youth work, has been completely decimated. In Liverpool, where he began his career on the beat as a bobby, walking the beat, in Liverpool there used to be 93 council-employed youth workers. Guess how many there are now? Go on, guess. Nope. Nope. Lower. Nearly. Lower. 2. There are 2. There were 93 council-employed youth workers, and now there are 2. Doesn't single out a single party for blame on this, but I'll tell you who's to blame in a moment, or who I think might be to blame. And he criticises politicians of all parties for promising more officers as a way to fight crime while never really talking of prevention. Struggles for funding, despite showing it can divert people away from offending. You know why, don't you? There's no money to be made in prevention. That's not really true in the United Kingdom, but in the United States of America, prevention is a nightmare because of the amount of profits that people make from running private prisons. But prevention as opposed to punishment. And this isn't even rehabilitation, which is still a relatively dirty word in right-wing circles in this country. This is about the path not taken. 1980s, a city, Liverpool in this case, blighted by unemployment, economic collapse in the early years of Margaret Thatcher. He says, I saw firsthand that crime was rarely just a policing problem. It was the symptom of deeper societal failures. And his message is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago, but it's arguably no better heeded under the current Labour government than it was under previous Tory governments. He talks about how well local services work together to identify and support vulnerable children and young people. Talks about society essentially working like a village to look after and help raise young people. So one element of it is youth workers, but of course council-employed youth workers would once have been working in youth clubs. So I'd like to apologise to you if I dismissed you out of hand when you told me that the single most important answer to the questions I was asking 10, 15 years ago was youth workers and youth clubs. And I would like to ask you today, well, what would I like to ask you today? I think what I'd like to try to do is work out what path you didn't go down and what stopped you. So you look back now and you could be anywhere, I think, from, mid-40s to older, looking at the era that's concerned, looking at the era that we're discussing. And there's a wonderful poem by Robert Frost. I always slightly misremember it, but it's something like two paths diverged in a wood and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. And what Andy Cook is talking about here is the path less travelled by, the path that's a bit harder to go down, because when you're a kid and you're exposed to bad influences and you're skint and there's nobody there to help you, you're much more likely to go down the path of criminality. The more poverty there is, the bigger the path of criminality becomes. There's a story in the news today about a kid who stole tens of thousands of pounds worth of goods from Holland and Barrett and Boots stalls. I don't know what he was nicking, but I imagine, looking at the figures of how much he thieved, he must have been Manuka honey, which is an extraordinarily expensive product that I just found myself thinking, oh yeah, they sell a lot of that in Holland and Barrett, and I bet they sell it in Boots as well. But anyway, I digress, because he's in court. And if he'd been any older, he'd have been facing a custodial sentence. And he just says, well, I'm easily led astray. And it's quite a poignant bit of reporting, actually. I don't want to misrepresent it. But he was talking about his granddad. His granddad is showing him the straight and narrow. His granddad has told him that he could have gone to prison. And his granddad now is just the person that he wants to spend all his time with. His granddad could be the person that steers this kid away from a path of criminality. And I want to know who it was, looking back, that saved you. That's all. If it was a youth worker or a youth club, I just want you to explain to a skeptic, and I'll be the skeptic, the difference that it makes. In many ways, I want to examine just how wrong I was for years when I was dismissive of the very mention of youth clubs and youth workers in the context of reducing crime. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I know I was wrong, and I think it's because of my privileged education, and I think part of the reason why successive governments, led by public school boys, I suppose with the exception of John Major and Margaret Thatcher, but if you're looking at Tony Blair or David Cameron, that attitude which has dominated politics for my entire life, it's only now you've got a cabinet that is not dominated by public school boys. I just don't think they realised how important these places were, because we had our own clubs after school. We had like a fly fishing club at one of my schools. Can you believe it? There's a bloke teaching us how to tie flies to go fly fishing with. Most of us had never been near a trout in our lives, but it was better than whatever else was on offer at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. And you had poetry clubs and debating clubs and drama clubs and table tennis clubs and bridge clubs. So we never, if you went to a school like mine, never really knew what it was like to have nothing to do. I just want your memories, really, of having something to do in a world where you otherwise would have had nothing to do. How big a deal? Explain to a sceptic, if you can, why youth clubs and youth workers were so important, and why it is a national tragedy that there are hardly any left. All right? That's what I want from you. Your story, or indeed your explanation of why, to a sceptic, the artist formerly known as me, horribly wrong about all of this. Perhaps you're an ex-youth worker. Blow your own trumpet. God knows I do it enough. About the difference that you made. How big an impact upon Great Britain has the diminishment in youth clubs and youth workers had? 0345 6060 973. And what difference did they make to you?
James O'Brien on LBC.
And there is no world, I don't think, where the gap is bigger between what we might loosely describe as the ruling class and everybody else. This only hit me a couple of years ago, trying to work out why I'd been such an idiot when it came to youth clubs and youth workers. And the answer was blindingly obvious. It was staring me in the face. You go to a school like mine, a fee-paying boarding school, then you are being looked after all the time. And you are bored sometimes, but only through choice. There is always an adult in a position of supervision. It wasn't always healthy, obviously. Both of my schools had terrible sex abuse scandals, but that's a conversation for a different day. Trying to understand why the political establishment could have defunded and abandoned youth clubs so completely over so many years is not that difficult when you look at people like me. And our inability or failure, or, if you want to be unkind, refusal to recognise how important they were. I don't know whether we thought they all sounded a little bit Enid Blyton or a little bit Richmond Crompton. Or what do you mean a youth club? What are they all going to do? Play Twister? These are potential young criminals. They're knife-carrying hoodlums. A youth club isn't going to... And of course it does. It really does, but I want you to describe it to me or help a sceptic understand. Here's there's a brilliant example come in by text already. Quite a few of you mentioning Biker Grove. And again, my snobbery and privilege kicks in a bit, because I would respond to that 10 years ago by going, can we just confine ourselves to the real world, please? But I guess the reason why Biker Grove resonated with so many people was because it reflected a world that they recognised. Up to a point. I think PJ or Duncan being blinded in a paintballing accident was probably stretching the parameters of reality a little bit too far. That was a sort of jumping the shark moment. But it is a world in which the people who dominate the media and the people that dominate British politics have spent almost no time whatsoever, which is why Andy Cook's comments are so interesting. You look at the people who dominate the media, the judiciary and politics. And I'm using the word dominate. It's not exclusive. It's not a monopoly. But the men in particular who dominate the media, who dominate the judiciary and who dominate British politics all had upbringings or educations that had little or no need of youth clubs. And that explains to me how the political establishment over decades could have effectively denuded something of such epic value. This is good from Tess. When I was released from prison, I was taken under the wing of a youth worker in Cornwall. He also had done a little bit of singing, so they got me into music production, among other things, and showed me that there was more to life than crime. And he could see that I had a taste for crime because I hadn't been scared of prison. I will never forget that man. And that's what I mean. So if you are from the kind of background I've described, you would have thought that that young man was doomed. That's it. They're a recidivist. They're a criminal. There's no point putting the effort in. But a good youth worker would see the room for redemption. And it's really redemption that I want to talk about today. Tony's in Donegal. Tony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Just it rang with me what you were saying about youth workers. I often think about
I was born in 1962. I lived around near the Goulburn Road in London.
Oh yeah, I know it
well. I often think about a guy that was he was ex-army. He served in the army, and he ran a youth club voluntarily. He operated it 3 nights a week, I think, and at weekends he used to take us away to go fishing, and otherwise we wouldn't have got out of London, And
what would have happened to you otherwise? I mean, we can't know for sure, but what other temptations were being dangled in front of you?
Well, I know I never did it. I was a good boy, but I know like guys I was at school with, they got involved in thieving, and actually some of them used to go out and actually rob people in the street, mug them, And I was never tempted to do that, but he would, like, if somebody came in and they had a problem, and there were aggressive guys there,
yes.
and he used to put them in the ring, and he'd get them sparring, or he'd get them working out, and he'd get them doing circuit training, and get them talking. At the end of the night, you'd sort of stand around and have a chat, and people's problems would come out that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have an outlet for them,
I mean, we talk a lot about the relationship between poverty and crime, and a certain type of character, for reasons I don't fully understand, will dismiss it. I think it's often, Tony, a denial of luck. It's like, people who have been lucky enough to have privileged upbringings don't like to acknowledge that they've had any luck at all. They think that the reason why they're not poor or why they're not in trouble is because of some innate character qualities or some innate skills. So we talk a lot about the role that poverty plays. I wonder how big a role boredom plays in youth crime, actual boredom.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, back in that would have been the early 70s, early to mid 70s. So,
yes.
We weren't stuck watching the TV or PlayStation or anything like that. So, sort of make up your own.
Even if you were playing PlayStation, if you were playing it with other people, you'd be engaged in something that you're not otherwise engaged in. I'd love to see some research into just boredom and the role that it plays in youth crime. Tony, thank you. Lovely part of the word, Donegal. 28 minutes after 12 is the time. Emma is in Sleaford. Emma, what would you like to say?
Well, I went to a youth centre in the 90s, Norwood Youth Centre. It was based in a school in South London in Lambeth.
Yeah.
And it was the best time of my life,
really?
I have to say. Yeah, absolutely. It brought people from different graphics together, demographics together in an area. And the youth workers they weren't that old. They were normally in their early 20s, mid-20s, although that's what they looked like to us.
Yeah, of course, they could have been 112. There's old and there's not old at that age.
They were cool, they were cool.
Yeah.
They had dreadlocks, they had deflated fashions on. They were amazing. We had a beautician there that used to crimp our hair because we couldn't afford to pay for that. We had tennis, we had badminton, we had clay model making pots, table tennis. I would have never done those kind of things if my parents had to pay for that. We were not a rich family. At one point, my dad had 3 jobs.
Yeah.
And in the area, I mean, it's a posh area now, but it wasn't then. It's well off.
I mean, how do we know? I mean, bits of it are self-evident from what you're describing, in that you were engaged, you were the opposite of bored, and bored people often do the silliest things that they'll ever do when they are bored.
It gives you aspirations.
Does it?
Listen, the people that were teaching the tennis and the badminton, they weren't from working class backgrounds.
No,
they were from upper middle class backgrounds that used to teach us. It showed you what you could do if you were good at something. And you don't understand the talents that they probably found within the youth of that day as well, to bring them forward, to give them aspiration, to apply themselves, and just give you a more worldly view of the actual world, what you could do, that these things, simple things like playing tennis, wasn't out of your remit. I mean, they took me on holiday. They took me on holiday, and I think it was something like 25 quid, not even that, on a canal trip. I mean...
It's still with you, isn't it? You're still carrying this.
I've got pictures of it. I'm still friends with those people today on Facebook, even though we don't live in the same area.
And the workers would have been on the council payroll, probably, by the sounds of it?
Yeah, it was council run. You had to pay a membership of £1.50 a year. You got a little pass. And I did trampoline in there. I'd never done that in my life.
So I'm taking over a council, and whether it's austerity,
youth workers were invaluable.
But what I just quickly want to understand is, because I've got my theory, you've heard me explain it. Who would think, oh yeah, that's something we'll get rid of without any trouble, without any problems? And I think it has to be people that went to schools like mine.
Yeah, I do, and I think it was a travesty when they started getting rid of the youth workers, because listen, you used to get people from, it wasn't just from that school, and it wasn't from the surrounding schools. Billy would bring his cousin and his second cousin, they would come, that stopped postcode wars going on, and because that was never heard of in those days. You had slightly older kids mixing with 7-year-olds in the summer schemes when it was for parents so they could work. You used to go down there, you used to pay $1.50, we all used to sit on the benches and have our lunch, and that's when we used to play the tennis and do the outside sport. The older kids would then get involved on volunteering on those days. I volunteered down there for the younger kids doing sports and so forth. It just involved the whole community.
And finally, how many people, I presume not you, but possibly, might have got into trouble had it not been for this option?
I would say at least 60%.
Because a lot of those
are from council estates in those days where drugs was starting to be rife.
Yeah.
Gun violence was also around in those days, quite predominantly rather than knife crime.
Yeah.
I know that and we knew the rough kids.
Sure.
But it's sort of, they used to come now and then, they weren't regular visitors. And they used to see it. They used to see maybe what they could be like.
Yeah.
They didn't have to be a cement of their family.
Yeah, crikey. Yeah, no, letting you break the cycle. You can't be what you can't see. And if you have, I bet the young youth workers, I hadn't thought of it like that. I had a sort of image like the first caller in Donegal of a sort of ex-military old fella teaching them all how to box, but it's the young people who are making the right choices themselves, but know how easy it is to make the wrong choices, who are seeking to influence the next generation. What a lovely call, Emma. Thank you. 12:32 is the time. Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:35 is the time. I mean, listen, it's hard to keep complete tabs on everything, but talking about what Donald Trump is doing in Iran and not talking about what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing in Iran and indeed in Lebanon is a trap that's very, very easy to fall into. We'll rectify some of that shortly, but it is to America I turn your attention first, because as you just heard from Amelia in the news bulletin, Donald Trump has posted something else on social media, and it is important and unimportant. It is meaningful and meaningless at the same time, as we have now been saying for over a month. It is important because it is a president. It is unimportant because it is this president, and this president can undo what he did 10 minutes ago in 10 minutes' time. It is important because it is from the Oval Office or the White House, and it is unimportant because it isn't worth the paper or indeed the social media platform that it's printed on, because he will say in the space of a 5-minute window 2 completely contradictory things. And finally you understand what Orwell was banging on about when he wrote War is Slavery, War is Peace, Ignorance is Slavery, Freedom is Strength. Literal, because then the people can't believe anything. So I'll read it to you, but with the constant caveat that unlike the markets, which have little choice but to treat everything as if it's ex cathedra, we don't. All of those countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refuse to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, I have a suggestion for you. Number 1, buy from the US, we have plenty. And number 2, build up some delayed courage, go to the Strait and just take it. You'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. So Donald Trump is now claiming that he has helped us by precipitating the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. If that's help, I'd hate to see what hindrance looked like. He goes on, Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil. So what he's suggesting is that a country that has been decimated and decapitated is still capable of stopping passage through a Strait of Hormuz that was operating perfectly just one short month ago before he decided, alongside Benjamin Netanyahu, to stop dropping bombs on things. So it's meaningful but meaningless at the same time. And it is my job, of course, to bring it to your attention. But unlike a lot of people in my profession, I add the constant caveat that he could resile from this position completely in the space of the next 3 hours. Noga Tarnopolsky is a freelance journalist based in Jerusalem who has been of immeasurable help and value to us in recent years, and to whom we probably should have spoken sooner. And there is quite a lot to get through, Noga, today. So let's just begin with a quick fact check, if we may. I thought I saw yesterday Itamar Ben-Gvir guzzling champagne while celebrating a bill that will bring the death penalty back to Israel. But just to clarify one thing, did I also see that he was wearing a sort of little golden noose on his lapel?
Yes, I think the only thing I should correct you on is I don't think it was champagne. I think it was cheap supermarket bubbly.
Thank you.
But
that's a fact check.
We take our job seriously here.
Indeed.
Let me just tell you about that little golden noose, because obviously it's an obscenity, but it's even worse than you think. You may remember that until October, the families of Israeli hostages held by Hamas, wore their symbol, which was this yellow ribbon kind of tied together. Yeah. And Ben-Gvir, of course, let's just add, Ben-Gvir, who is a man with 13 convictions for terror associations and hate crimes, who Benjamin Netanyahu refused to be seen with in public until a little over 3 years ago, appointing him the minister in charge of police. This guy was opposed to all of the deals that freed those hostages, and he made a career out of mocking those families who had lost the dearest to them in a terror attack. And so that noose, it's not just a hangman's noose, but it's also to make fun of the struggle of the families who wanted to end the war in Gaza to free their loved ones.
Oh, God. Why would a man with the convictions for terrorist associations that you described be celebrating legislation that would allow the State of Israel to execute terrorists?
Well, it's a victory for him. The entire political arena opposed this law. The military opposes this law. The judiciary opposes this law. The foreign ministry opposes this law. So for someone who basically is a career hooligan, this is a big win. And he even got the prime minister to vote for it. But the law wasn't written to be taken seriously as a law.
Right.
The law was written as a kind of finger in the eye of the Israeli civil code, with the intention and the knowledge that it'll never be enacted, that the Supreme Court instead is going to rule it completely unconstitutional, which it is, and therefore, in time for what are still expected to be elections before the end of this year, Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu will be able to run on their favorite slogan, which is that the judiciary acts like a dictatorship and prevents them, who are legally elected officials, from enacting the policies the public elected them to enact.
I mean, I suppose an unsurprising position for a convicted criminal and a prime minister still facing charges to adopt.
Yes, I agree, but it's, the diplomatic and international damage done to Israel is immense when you take into account that, as offensive as it is, this is a political gimmick.
And as you mentioned earlier, he's the Minister of National Security. Speaking of international outrage, just a quick word, if you would, on the extraordinary moment on Sunday when the Latin Patriarch, the head of the Roman Catholic Church in Jerusalem, was stopped from entering the church that is reputedly on the site of Christ's tomb on Palm Sunday, of all days.
That's right. We're talking about Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who is really a revered figure here, but who apparently, from what I've been able to understand, some Jerusalem street cops who wanted to please their boss, the Jerusalem, that station of police at the Old City is now run by a direct appointment of this hooligan minister. Right. So apparently, without realizing that they were causing an international incident, they didn't know who he was. They didn't know his visit was coordinated and perfectly fulfilled the regulations of wartime religious ceremonies. It was the cardinal with the custos, who is the Vatican emissary here, and 3 other priests. That's it. Anyway, the police stopped them, prohibited them from proceeding, and instead the cardinal held this ceremony at the Church of Gethsemane, much more dangerous spot in terms of the war, by the way, much less protected, and many more people attended because of the scandal that had been caused by this police.
Thank you for that, Noga. And Netanyahu pressed reverse on that fairly swiftly when the scale of international outrage was becoming clear.
Well, it took him a good 18 hours,
right.
And then he released a statement just in English in an attempt to stave off further condemnation. That's true, but it was at midnight when he did that.
Oh, gosh. And so to the war, Donald Trump's approval ratings are in free fall as a consequence of his engagement in Iran. This is one area where they are not in lockstep with each other because approval for it in Israel is rather higher, I think.
It is, but it's plummeting. It's very interesting. When you take into account that this war began just a month ago and Israelis were promised safety, Israelis were promised by their government that the regime in Iran would be gone, that the nuclear program would be gone. And so, yes, more than 95% of Israelis at that time supported it. Jumped to just 1 month later, and 68% of Israelis are supporting this.
Gosh.
And among Jewish Israelis, it's 78%. The Arab population of Israel never really supported this and still doesn't. But it's while it's still a high approval rating, it's really a steep decrease of 20 points in just a month.
And are they holding Netanyahu responsible for that, or Trump, or a combination of the two, or I presume not anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that because in the Israel Democracy Institute poll that I saw, it just came out yesterday, I didn't see that question asked directly. Who do you hold responsible? There's still quite a high level of confidence in the military leadership and the chief of staff. But this has not been a popular government since before the war started, when Netanyahu started his attempt to change the system of government in Israel to make it more authoritarian. So he continues to not be a popular prime minister.
So, well, that said, I mean, one reading of why this war is being undertaken at all will be the imminent elections that you alluded to at the beginning of this conversation. With a 68% approval rating, he is still arguably getting what Donald Trump hoped he would get from starting this war, which is a boost in the polls, politically, or not?
He's not.
He's not.
He's not at all. And it's even more interesting than that. Even when Israeli approval for this war was above 90%, approval for Netanyahu didn't go up even 1 point.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So Israelis believe that the war to eliminate the nuclear threat from Iran was justified, but they don't like his handling of the stuff at all.
Wow. Noga, thank you. You're clearly not in your office at the moment, so I'm particularly grateful to you for your time and your characteristic clarity on some complicated and quite diverse issues. Noga Tarnopolsky, they're live from, I'm just going to double check, from a supermarket car park, is it, in Jerusalem?
It's not a supermarket, but it is a car park.
Oh, there you go, 50-50. It's better than Trump. It's 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 1, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I'm going to read out this message from. I'm just going to make sure Eleanor is comfortable. Can I read out this message from Steve? And there we go. Let me I'll tell you. It says, "Hello, are these messages read by anyone?" Is it okay if I read that one out? Thanks. Thank you. "Hello," says Steve. "Are these messages read by anyone?" No. I think I deserved a bit more credit yesterday for a comedy moment with a police officer who got on air. And Nick Abbott does this all the time. And anything I do on the radio that's funny, Nick Abbott has done about 1 million times before, about 50 years ago. No, it makes it sound like I'm mocking his age. About 10 years ago. So lovely lady comes on, police officer, just retired, I think. And she says, "Can you hear me?" So I said, "No." And she just went silent. Like, she believed me. And then, this is where I think that I didn't get the credit I deserved. Then I speculated that if she was on a job as a police officer and she went into a house and there was a burglar upstairs, she'd shout up the stairs, "Is there anybody up there?" And the burglar would shout down the stairs, "No," and she'd get back in the car and drive back to the police station. I thought that was funny. But I got nothing from you. Nothing. Speaking of ideas, Eleanor and I were talking in the last break after that brilliant dispatch from Jerusalem from Noga about whether this is the most deranged thing Donald Trump has ever done on social media, and Sheila's going to be talking about it shortly, but my view was it's not even in the top 10. I'll read it to you in its entirety, then we'll get back to the conversation about youth clubs. All of those countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, I have a suggestion for you. Number 1, buy from the US, we have plenty. And number 2, build up some delayed courage, go to the Strait and just take it. I'd imagine taking a lecture on courage from Donald Trump, President Bone Spurs himself. You'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us, as a man who's never heard of Suez. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil, President DJT. And Eleanor said, is that the most deranged thing he's done? And my gut reaction was, nah. And then, because of what I do and who I am, my second reaction was, is that a phone-in? Should we do that? Can you ring me with what you think is the most deranged thing he's ever done? Like posted or behaviour or words? Actual words or deeds? I would actually... because every day I find myself thinking, oh, yeah, we forgot about that. Oh, yeah, I never got around to mentioning that. It's beginning to happen on a much tinier scale with Farage. Like today, I forgot that the police had said shut up and go away with regards to his lies about the by-election in Gorton and Denton, which he continues to lie about. I just find myself thinking there's so much now that you have to really be on your toes to stay across it all. But with Trump, it's off the charts. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Are we going to encourage that? Are we going to do an actual bit of a top Trump's battle on the most deranged things the deranged Donald Trump has done? It's even got a nice bit of alliteration to it. I don't know. But I do know this. I was wrong for years about youth clubs, but I'm not wrong now. Amian is in Sheffield. Amian, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. Brilliant show. First time caller to your show.
You're very welcome.
Nervous.
Thank you. It's only me. There's nothing to be nervous about.
Yeah. Well, no, I grew up in Sheffield, so in an area of Sheffield in the East End, Darnell, in the probably late 70s. Early 80s, and we had 4 youth clubs in our area.
Good
the main
Lord.
one was called Coleridge Youth Club. It was a big old school, Coleridge School. We had table tennis, we had snooker, we had a skateboarding room, we could do roller skating, we had a 5-a-side pitch, we had a disco room, and the youth workers were just Mick, Pat. I can remember them. They were like family.
Really?
They were like family, yeah. Because you couldn't really some of us couldn't really speak to us as parents at time.
Yeah.
So they were like older siblings, they were like aunties, they were like uncles.
Good Lord.
And the kids come from the neighbouring estates as well, from the areas like Tinsley and the Manor, Littledale, and we got to know each other. Do you know what I mean? So it brought people together.
I'd missed this element of it, because I was thinking about it, obviously, as an alternative to an unhealthy path. So it sort of keeps you on the straight and narrow. It gives you things to do when you could be out getting up to no good or doing mischief. But what you and other callers have really brought home to me is that it creates community spirit.
Yeah, we still got friends. I mean, some of the youth workers, some of them passed. But,
yes, of course.
On our lives, they had a really positive... Do you know what I mean? They'd sit and talk to you. If you'd got into trouble at school, you could sit and talk to me. If you'd been in trouble with police, they'd sit down and ask you why. You know what I mean? They didn't judge you. They tried to guide you. And I'm still friends with some of them to this day.
That's lovely.
And without that youth club, I think a lot of us would have gone down a different path without the guidance from the youth workers. And even some of the people that went to that club became youth workers.
Yeah,
and like you said, they all had to constantly go for a job after job after job when they was cutting all the youth work. And I really feel sorry for the youth today that they didn't have that experience what I had.
When did they start shutting? Well, first of all, how many are left now? I think I probably know.
I don't think there's any. I think there may be one, which is like a drop-in centre, but all them they've all closed down. They all started closing down probably in the mid-2000s. A lot of them started closing down. But my friends that went into youth work, they just constantly, well, most of them are out of youth work now because there's no positions.
No, well, I just find it, the more I talk about it, and it's not the first time we've talked about this on the programme, the more it's simultaneously baffling and not baffling, isn't it? Because if you knew the world that you grew up in, you could never have contemplated closing these places down.
No, because it was a lifeline to these young kids who some of us had one parent working, some of us had no parents working. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
and it was somewhere for us to go.
And you and Emma, I think, speaking for a heck of a lot of people at different ends of the country, one in South London, one up in Sheffield, and just describing what really every politician should be in favour of, especially the ones who like to use words like integration and things like that. This is literally a way in which you drive home from a very early age what young people in a community have in common rather than the things that potentially set them apart. Amy, and what a lovely call. You know, my mum's from Sheffield.
Is she? Which part? She's from the affluent part.
I knew you were going to say that. My granddad worked for Metropolitan Vickers. Well, it was gone by the time you were born, but it was a big steelworks. I'm not as posh as I sound, Damien.
Yeah, well, we're from the East End. We're the East End, where all the steel industry were. But whatever.
But that's where he was. He was working for one of the big steel firms. I'm pretty sure it was called Metropolitan Vickers. Someone will correct me imminently if it wasn't. I did Question Time a billion years ago up in Sheffield, and I had that in my back pocket to get the audience on side. I was going to say, my granddad used to work, but I forgot. Amy, thank you. That's pretty much it from us for today. I tell you what, if this is a joke, Pete, it's a very good one. James, Nick Abbott has already done Trump's most deranged actions. No, he's done the bingo card, Pete, as you point out, but I don't think he's actually done a phone-in on what is the most deranged thing Donald Trump has ever done. And is it today's text, which demonstrates not only an ignorance of the Suez crisis, which you'd think he might have had a passing knowledge of, but also, of course, the hypocrisy of accusing other people of lacking courage. It's a man who was a multiple draft dodger who routinely maligns the memories of dead soldiers, whether they're British, American, Danish, or indeed any other allies of his country, and who's talking about the necessity of us buying our fuel, I think specifically jet fuel, but how much would you bet that he has absolutely no idea that the US and Norway are already the biggest suppliers of our oil and gas imports in this country? Would you think he would know that? Because if you do, there's a bridge I'd quite like to sell you. And Sheila will be diving into this topic imminently. But that is it from me for today. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back. I tell you what, I'm glancing at the clock and thinking we might actually hit it on time today for the first time in 2026. Let's not spoil it by talking too slowly. You can also stay up to date with all the latest news, videos and opinions. You can listen to a range of podcasts, including James O'Brien Daily, the best bits of this show every day, and download the official app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now, at 12:59...
You've got 5 seconds to do those Irish breathing exercises I told you about.
It's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you very much, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.